Thank you, Isaac, for being on the show.
Thanks, Matt. I'm happy to be here.
I think in America you say Isaac.
Isaac.
In Australia it's Isaac.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Isaac.
Just thought I'd
in Spanish,
open with that to
Isaac,
grip people.
You know?
Nice. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I asked Stephen Johnson back in the day if he'd come on my show to discuss Mormonism, and to his credit, he prayed about it and said, maybe have Isaac on instead. And so we had him on anyway. And but it's wonderful to have you on to discuss.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. I'm very flattered to be invited.
Cool. I want to give people kind of just a heads up as to where you are now.
Okay.
You know, I don't want to. So you were LDS.
I was raised LDS.
Yeah. You started to have doubts. You started to explore. We'll get into it.
We'll get into it. Yeah. If you want like the very high level
give
bullet
us that
point,
real quick. Yeah.
I was raised LDS. I served a mission. Went to BYU. Got married to my wife in the LDS Temple. Kind of had a very long, slow process of doubt and that sort of thing, and then became very interested in Eastern Orthodoxy for probably about 5 years or so, and then eventually became Catholic. I was baptized at the Easter Vigil in 2021.
Wonderful. And your beautiful bride is still LDS.
And my wife is still LDS.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we've got 4 kids.
Wonderful.
I don't know if I said that already, but
yeah. Whenever we do a show like this, maybe I'll interview a Protestant or a former Protestant, right, or a former Mormon. I really want to say in good faith what I love about their background or who they used to be a part of.
Yeah.
And it's really not, well, I don't think it's to soften the blow. Like it's sincere. So I just want to say, like, even though I have very strong opinions about the LDS scriptures and things like that, I have tremendous respect for my LDS friends and the work that they're doing. I used to speak a lot on pornography, and all the giants, like just refuting pornography, helping people overcome pornography, many of them are LDS.
Yeah.
I'm so grateful for them. Things like VidAngel was started by LDS.
Yeah, they're based in Provo, Utah.
I just, the other night was watching BYU with the kids because it's like really good entertainment. It's gripping. It's not preachy. Like I think a lot of Catholic kind of entertainment would just come off as like bad. I mean, I'm sure there's some good stuff out there, but so I am really grateful for the work that Mormons do. And I want that to be clear, that, and I'm sure you would agree with me, like nothing we're going to say today about our Mormon friends is meant to be a personal attack on anybody.
No, absolutely. And I think that, I'll echo that too. When we get into this, I absolutely loved growing up LDS. It was such a beautiful and blessed childhood, and just it gives such a structure to your life, and it helps you encounter so much good. There's so much good in the LDS community, in the LDS faith, and I think there's a lot of areas where Catholics could learn from LDS brothers and sisters and that sort of thing. So yeah, I do think it's possible to disagree and to express disagreement in ways that's like respectful and loving. And
I'm not sure though if it's possible to express disagreement respectfully or honestly in a way that's taken as if it were respectfully. Like that's just a difficult thing to do.
I think it's possible. I do.
Okay, I agree that it's possible objectively, but you cannot, obviously interfere with the subjective reception of what you're saying.
You can't guarantee how it's going to be received by another person. I would agree with that. But
I was at Target a couple of years ago, and my wife came out, and she went, there was this big family. I think it was my wife. This big family in Target. And I'm like, were they well put together or shabby looking? She went, well put together. I went, okay, Mormons, that's awesome. If they were shabby, I was going to go Catholic,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's hilarious.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, and one thing that I want to say as we get started, I know that, I don't know if you're aware, but the LDS Church over the last couple of years has been really trying to get rid of the word Mormon as like a reference to themselves. They've asked specifically that people refer to them as...
And why do you think that is?
Well, the reason they say is because, so the name of the church, I'm sure you know, is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And when people call them the Mormon Church, it kind of like removes the name of Jesus Christ from the church, and they want to have more emphasis on Jesus.
When it comes to nicknames of the church, the most glaring omission is the absence of the Savior's name.
I don't like that because I think the Jesus that Mormons talk about is not the real Jesus. And so to me, it just seems like a PR move where we have to put Jesus front and center.
Yeah. But
respecting what people want to be called, fine.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it just as a name. So I just wanted to say, like, during the interview, I'll try to refer to them as Latter-day Saints, LDS
I'll do the same.
Church. The church's name is a bit of a mouthful, so it's not practical to say the whole thing every single time. But yeah, I mean, I think we can get into this later too about, the question of like the Jesus LDS people believe in versus the Jesus of Catholicism or traditional Christianity. Certainly there are aspects that are very different in terms of like the nature, Jesus's nature and that sort of thing. But there is also commonality in the sense that both Catholics and Latter-day Saints believe in a historical figure who lived 2,000 years ago, whose works are recorded in the New Testament.
Yes.
And they study the New Testament and they try to follow his teachings, you know what I mean, as they understand them and that sort of thing. So while there's certainly like, there's aspects of this historical Jesus, aspects of your belief that we think are incorrect, it's also not like they believe Jesus is, like I've heard someone say, maybe it was in you, like, what if they said, I believe in Jesus, but they mean this guy who works at the Mexican restaurant down the street. Well, it's clearly not a case of that. Like both people were pointing to the same historical figure, but there's aspects, theological aspects and things like that about that person where there's very significant. Totally significant disagreement. Yes, I agree with that.
Okay. So what was it like growing up Mormon?
Oh, it was amazing. It was amazing for me. It's not amazing for everybody, but I loved it. I mean, so I grew up in a very, very LDS family, very old LDS family. Like all my ancestors are LDS. If you go back to like, if you look at my family tree and you go back like 4 or 5 generations, I think at that level, every single one of my ancestors was like born and raised LDS. I don't know how far back you have to go to find someone who joined the LDS Church. I'm named after my great-great-great-great-grandfather who was an early LDS convert, like in the days of Joseph Smith, and traveled with him across the West and that sort of thing. So it just everything, every aspect of our life was infused with the church. So we did there are very like kind of classic home observances that you have in the LDS faith. Like they encourage reading scriptures as a family every single day, which we did that one night a week. And this was more emphasized when I was a kid. I haven't heard it emphasized as much recently, but we would have something called family home evening.
Love it.
Where every Monday night, the family would get together and it was structured. We would start with a prayer. We'd have some songs that we'd sing together. So one of my parents would present like a short gospel lesson, like teach us about the faith. And then we would play games and have a treat. That was family home evening. And we did that very consistently all growing up. We ended up having a big family. I'm the second oldest. So in my younger years, we were small, just a couple kids, but we were 8 kids in my family by the time I graduated from high school. And it was just fun, like lots of good friends. I grew up we moved around a bit when I was little, but by the time I finished elementary school, we lived in Utah, in Orem, Utah, which at the time was probably about the most LDS place in the country. In my high school, for instance, I had a very large group of friends, and I had one friend that wasn't LDS, and she joined the LDS Church my junior year.
Okay.
I actually baptized her.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. It's important to say this, right? Because I know certainly a lot of people will come out and say how horrible it was being raised Catholic.
Yes.
And it's like, fair enough. People have different experiences and people also have different parents, and some parents are horrible and some priests are horrible and some people are horrible, but it's good. It's like when people tell me how they've only had horrible experiences of priests, I can say with full objectivity that I never had a bad experience with a priest. I mean, the only bad experience I may have had is when I felt like he was a heretic, which is terrible, but never in the sense of, when I go to confession, I was never yelled at. I never had a priest like come on to me, as you hear people kind of never. It was always good. So it's important that we...
Absolutely. And I mean, I've known lots of people who have talked about, LDS culture can be very moralistic at times, and some people find that very difficult growing up. I always just kind of had that heart of like, being LDS gave me this vision of like who I was and who I could be, and I just wanted it, right? And so even in the times, as a teenager when I struggled with the things that teenagers always struggle with, sexuality and that sort of thing, to me, the teachings of the church and going through process of like trying to overcome vice was really life-giving. I thought it was great. You know, even uncomfortable things like meeting with church leaders to talk about, you know, things I was struggling with. For some people, they end up carrying on this like deep shame. And that just wasn't my experience.
Yeah, you were met with understanding, compassion, encouragement.
Yeah, so and it helped me, and I was able to overcome those things pretty easily at a young age. And so I was like, great, I had this. I mentioned my big group of friends, some of whom I'm still friends with today from high school. 25 years later, and we would, we just did all sorts of like silly, dumb teenage things. But we would also do things like meet every week to read scriptures together and go to church with each other and that sort of thing. So it was just a really beautiful way of growing up, and grew up in a really great place in a really nice time in the 90s, just as the internet
ruined everything.
Just as the internet ruined everything, right? I remember sitting at home chatting with my friends on AOL Instant Messenger in like 10th, 11th grade, something like that. For me,
it was MSN Messenger. I don't know, AOL may have not made it across to Australia by then, but yeah.
So that's kind of what high school was like.
Just quick side note. Remember when you would turn the modem on, it would make that terrifying sound?
Oh, yeah.
That was my accountability software back in the day. Before Covenant and I, 2 a.m, trying to turn that thing on.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, what I remember is, trying to download a song from Napster.
Yes.
And it would take like 20 minutes to download one song. And just when it was like 95% done, my mom would pick up the phone upstairs and kill the internet connection. And it's like, Mom, I almost had this like Weezer B-side that I was so interested in getting. Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah. The early internet was awesome.
Is it the expectation of, I think it is the expectation that male Mormons would go on a mission?
Yes.
What is that thought of? Is that thought of something like a rite of passage, or just a way that you're expected to serve, or how is that viewed?
Yeah, all of the above. Yes. So for me, even from when you're a little kid, we were taught that all of the males were called to be missionaries. And the females, like the sister, elders and sisters, the young women could serve missions if they wanted to, but that was more of like a personal discernment. For the young men, it was, you're called. So when you become of age, which when I was growing up, the age was 19, you're going to be expected to serve. And this is another area where there's a lot of cultural pressure. I had some friends who served missions, but afterwards ended up confiding in me that they really wish they hadn't. Like they didn't want to go, but the social and cultural detriment that you would experience if you like hadn't been a missionary was really severe.
If you didn't have a good reason.
Even if you did have a good reason.
Really?
Like, and that's gotten a lot better. People who can't serve for health reasons or whatever. But yeah, it was kind of like a mark of shame to not serve. But for me, I just wanted to.
I mean, looking at it in a really charitable way, I love the idea. It's like we're all called to be missionaries. And how many Catholics, by the time they get confirmed, let's say, they just think that's it. And they're not told to evangelize. Oh,
absolutely. And practically speaking, the time after high school is a really tumultuous time for a lot of people, especially young men, and it's so nice to have this structured thing that you go do for 2 years.
Well, dude, that's what I did with Net Ministries. I was a missionary with this group called Net up in Canada, where we traveled the whole country as a team of 12 young Catholics evangelizing. Yeah. And it's exactly what you were saying. Like, it is a tumultuous time, a time when a lot of young men might be aimless or just in their basement playing Xbox or something.
Exactly.
I got to do this
It gets you outside,
thing.
and you learn to grow up a bit. You learn some basic life skills. Some learn them better than others on your mission, but you're kind of living by yourself for 2 years. Well, you have other missionaries you live with, but there's no other adults around telling you what to do.
What's the training like? How does that work? Do you show up as a group of missionaries to be trained to then go out?
I want to get there, but can we go back to high school for just a moment?
Sure.
Is that okay?
Yeah, of course.
I want to talk about just like an experience I had when I was like a sophomore. So, growing up in Utah especially, everyone's LDS. And because everyone's LDS, I used to joke with some of my friends because I knew people who lived outside of Utah, and they said, the thing I hate about Utah is there's so many like non-practicing, like people who say they're LDS but don't live like it. And I would always say, well, yeah, I think in like the high school in Utah, it's like you have your really good kids, you've got your druggies, you've got your jocks, you've got all these different people. The difference is everyone's LDS. And so I remember in high school having this time where it really weighed on me when I was in 10th grade, like what kind of Latter-day Saint do I want to be? right? Like, do I want to be someone who like really takes my faith seriously? Is it just kind of a cultural thing for me? It was no question of like, am I going to be LDS? Like, of course I was. That was my whole world. But what kind was I going to be? And so I had some time where I was really like taking this seriously. This gives you like an insight to the kind of kid I was. I was also really silly and dumb, and loved fun. But I had this kind of spiritual, I don't know, sense and desire my whole life growing up. And there was this, I was reading the Book of Mormon once, and there was this, during that time, and I came on this verse that talked about how like God it's in the Book of Mormon called Omni. Mm-hmm. Sounds strange, I'm sure, but it is what it is. And in that, it talks about how it says God wants us to offer our whole souls as an offering to him. And this really just impacted me. And that was a time where it was a real pivot point in my life where I was like, that's what I want. I want to make my whole life like an offering to God. Mm-hmm. I don't want it to just be like, oh yeah, I'm Mormon, I go to church and I do the things that they ask, but don't take it that seriously. I really just decided to take it super seriously at that time. And I think that in many ways that was kind of like a pivot point for my life leading up till now, and it really made me desirous to serve my mission, not just because it was a cultural expectation, but because I was like so excited to get out there and tell people about Mormonism. I was very naive, I think is a safe way to say.
Yeah. But I mean, yeah, I read the Brothers Karamazov all the time. There's this beautiful section where the author is talking about Alyosha, the protagonist, and he's talking about his passion and his effusiveness and his desire to love radically, and he points out that this could be looked at as kind of naive and silly, but it's like, but if a man is not going to act radically and naively in his youth, when will he get to do it? Like this is
true.
The appropriate
That's
way.
True. Yeah.
And just like when I came back from Rome, became a Catholic, I was really over the top in many ways, but praise the Lord for that.
Yeah.
It's like love. You mean well, even if you don't have.
There's so much passion in the young, and it's such a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
And
this real belief that you can kind of change the world, and it's that simple.
Oh yeah. Yeah. When I went on my mission, I was just, to me, the truth of Mormonism was so obvious that I was truly convinced that any person of goodwill who sat down and studied it sincerely and prayed about it would come to believe in it, and that partially that goes back to kind of this very basic LDS belief about like the witness of the Holy Spirit. And that's how you come to know that Mormonism is the true faith. So when we were growing up, that was just what was like drilled into us. Like, you need to have this experience yourself. And so part of this is very good, right? They're like, you can't just rely on like the faith of your parents. You can't rely on the faith of your teachers or your friends. You need this experience. And, it's very explicit in the Book of Mormon at the very end. It tells you like, hey, when you read this book, pray and ask God if it's true. And by the power of the Holy Ghost, he'll tell you that it's true. And so all growing up, I kind of like sought after this experience of, kneeling down and being like, Lord, like, is Mormonism true? I really love it and I really believe it, but like, I want this experience. And the truth is I never really had it. At least not in the way that I kind of expected. And I found that this ends up being true for a lot of Latter-day Saints, where they say that prayer and they kind of have this general sense that it's like really good and beautiful. And there's other parts of the Book of Mormon that talk about how faith is like a seed that you plant that grows in your heart and eventually grows into a tree where the good fruit comes. And when
it's more gradual.
More gradual. When you taste the fruit, you kind of know that it's good.
Yeah.
And so for a lot of people, that's kind of like, they kind of say, well, that's my witness. Like, that's the Holy Spirit telling me that it's true.
There's something similar in Catholicism and Protestantism, right? Where someone might say to you, like, do you know Jesus Christ? And if you can't say yes, you've never met him yet. Or you'll think about these more charismatic strands of Catholicism where people talk about getting the gift of tongues or the gift of the Holy Spirit. And it does put a lot of pressure on the person, because then you feel like, well, if I don't have this, am I really a fully sold out Christian? And then you might accidentally manufacture the experience.
Yes.
And at the time you're unaware of that maybe, but you look back and now you question everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So as I prepared for my mission, this like really weighed on me. I had this night, I remember, where I was praying so like fervently for this, right? I was like, I want this experience. I want to be able to go on my mission and say, like, I know that this is true. That's a phrase that Latter-day Saints use a lot when they talk about their belief in Mormonism. They're like, I know it's true. And when what they mean is like, I've received a witness from the Holy Spirit telling me it's true. And if the Holy Spirit witnesses something to you, how could it be wrong, right? And I remember praying about this really sincerely and just wanting it so bad, and just nothing was happening. You know, I mean, I don't know if I was trying to manufacture an experience, but just wasn't coming. And I had this moment where almost in frustration, I was like, come on, Heavenly Father. That's usually how Latter-day Saints refer to God. Heavenly Father, I know it's true. Just tell me, you know? And I remember thinking, well, if I think I already know, why am I bothering asking, you know? So that was just kind of good enough for me.
What do you think you were expecting? What was the experience you were hoping
it's usually,
for?
well, what they usually say is like a feeling of just like immense like peace and assurance. It usually is kind of given in kind of emotive language, just like a kind of like feeling in your heart, sometimes even followed with like a physical sensation of a kind. I don't know. I mean, you've probably had spiritual experiences before where that kind of happens. Like you just feel this like incredible peace. You know, maybe your just kind of body feels a little on fire. You know, in another LDS scripture, they talk about like the burning in your bosom and that sort of thing. And so that's kind of, I think, what most people are looking for. And certainly I had lots of those experiences growing up, just like being LDS, right? Like singing a beautiful song or being around people talking about our faith, where you just kind of had that like peaceful assurance. And, you know, we were kind of taught to think, this is the Holy Spirit telling me that Mormonism is true. And that really like reinforces your sense. Like, I really believe this. Like it's got to be true. The Holy Spirit is constantly telling me that it's true.
Okay. So can we move on to the missionary thing? Because I am fascinated by that. I mean, the only thing I have to compare it to is my experience as a missionary in Canada, where there was like 70 people all get together, and we had like 6 weeks of training. You know, and it had to do with the basis of our faith, you know, how to evangelize, how to behave in host homes, like everything. Yeah. So what's it like for Mormon missionaries when the trainings?
Yeah. So you go to Missionary Training Center. They call it MTC.
That just must be cool.
It's super
wildly
cool.
fun.
Yeah.
Just to get together with a bunch of like-minded people. Yeah. Presumably.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So I was 19. I'd done 1 year of college already at BYU. And then I got my mission call to go to North Carolina. That's where I served my mission. And I was very disappointed because I wanted to go somewhere foreign and exotic and learn another language.
Right.
And so, you know, when I opened it up, I was kind of like, North Carolina?
Come on.
Although I will say this, and you know, if any North Carolinians are watching, I love North Carolina. And it did seem, I thought, well, if I was going to stay in the U.S., going to the South is probably about as foreign as I can get. And certainly certain parts of North Carolina were very foreign.
Are you paired up at this point, or is that only after? So individually, you get told where you're going.
That's right. Individually, you get told. You just say, so you put in your papers ahead of time. You fill out all these forms. I'm going to serve a mission, and you tell them all about you. And then you just get a letter in the mail. And it's like a big thing. People will gather with like friends and family to open up the mission call, they call it, and they read the letter. And, you know, you're like, you know, you have been called to serve and you read it off and everyone cheers. The North Carolina Raleigh mission. That was my mission. Yeah. And then they tell you the day. You're expected to report at the Provo MTC on this date. My date was July 2nd, 2003 was the day I reported to the Missionary Training Center. So on that day, your parents take you to the MTC with a whole bunch of other missionaries that are being dropped off that day. It's a Wednesday. It's always the ingestion day, you know? Okay. So there were probably, I don't know, hundreds of missionaries that entered the same day that I did.
Did you, is there anything specific that they were teaching you obviously there's a lot of specific things they were teaching you at training, but what's something that stands out?
So you study the lessons that you're going to teach prospective members. You study those a lot. People arrive at the MTC with like a wide variance of how well they know the faith, right? So like I knew the faith extremely well because I loved to study. I loved to read. I'd probably read the Book of Mormon like 10 times all the way through before I got there. Some people show up and they have never, like hardly cracked their scriptures open.
Did you get the sense that some people showed up out of obligation but
totally.
didn't really want to do it?
For sure.
And do some of them not make it? Some of the,
oh, yes. Yeah. My companion, so you get paired up when you get there. My companion in the MTC went home after like 6 days or something like that. So that definitely happens. So yeah, I mean, you basically spend the 2 weeks. So if you're learning a foreign language, which I wasn't, you get intensive, immersive language training. Wow. It's actually one of the best immersion language trainings in the world. Like they've patterned it after, and I think they've other people have patterned their language training after what they do. Because in something like 6 to 12 weeks, depending on the language, missionaries will come out of there with relatively basic language skills, enough to kind of converse on the street.
Wow.
You know. So for me, though, because I was English speaking, we spent our days mostly in a classroom, just studying and practicing teaching, you know, so we would practice teaching each other, and we would go to, they had like a special room where people would come in and pretend to be non-LDS people, and you would like practice teaching lessons, and they would ask questions and that sort of thing. So you just kind of do that. I was only there for about 3 weeks.
Okay, that's not long.
Yeah, no, not too long. And they prep you, like missions have a lot of rules. And so they prep you all about like how to keep the mission rules, how to be an obedient missionary.
Give us some of the rules.
Oh my gosh. They give you a handbook when you get there. It's like, you have to actually carry it with you at all times.
Okay.
And, or at least you did. I mean, I served my mission 20 years ago. So some of the rules have changed. Yeah. There's a very strict schedule. So when I was there, it went like this. You had to be up at 6:30 in the morning. And then you had like half an hour to shower and eat breakfast or something like that. And then you would study for a few hours. And then you were expected to be out the door by 9:30. I think it was 9. Maybe it was 9:30 in the morning. And then you would basically go out and proselytize all day with 1 hour break for lunch, 1 hour break for dinner, and you come back at 9:30 p.m. Other than that, you're expected to be out preaching the gospel.
It's amazing.
And then from 9:30 to 10:30, you kind of like come home. You're supposed to check in with like your leaders every single night. You call them up, tell them how your day went, make sure that you're alive. And then you go to bed, and it just repeats day after day.
You get the weekend off? Or?
No, 1 day off, one like half day off a week.
That sounds exhausting.
Oh my gosh, it's very exhausting. Yeah. It's
and it must take, I mean, there must be some sense of nervousness knocking on that first door.
Oh yeah.
Especially if you have a bad experience and you're traumatized by it, then you got to keep going.
I never got used to knocking on doors. I remember everyone telling us, you'll get used to it, but I just never did. I remember at the very end of my mission, you know, it was knocking doors. First of all, knocking doors is very ineffective.
Yeah.
It's just so rare that you find people just by randomly knocking doors. And they tell you this, right?
Maybe
when
50 years ago.
When they tell you this as a missionary, they say, hey, this is the least effective way of finding people. Like it's much more effective, for instance, to get referrals from people who are already members, like who their friends, like for friends and family, or to, I can't remember all the things we did, but so, you know, they have like this whole list, like here's like in order of effectiveness, but you just sometimes find yourself with nothing to do, and you're expected to be spending your time preaching. So when you find yourself nothing to do, you're just like, well, how about that street? And you just go knock on door after door after door.
Yeah.
And when I got there, I was full of zeal, right? So I remember the first day I arrived, like we kind of, you fly into like a central location, and then the people, your first companion, who's going to be your trainer, your training companion, takes you back to the spot where you're going to be serving. I was in Burlington, North Carolina, and the day I arrived, it was pouring rain. And excuse me, my companion was like, well, we had an appointment scheduled for tonight, but we don't have a car. And, you know, I don't want to ride my bike in this rain because, you know, and he said, she's not going to be there anyway. Right.
Who's she?
The woman with whom we had an appointment.
Okay.
And, you know, he said this out of a lot of experience. You know, there's a lot of times you meet people like, hey, can we come back next week and teach you a lesson? Oh yeah, absolutely. You know,
I'll make sure
what
I'm
time?
away.
This time, right? But, you know, as a brand new zealous missionary, I thought, no, none of that. Like there is someone who wants to hear the gospel. We got to go there. And he said, well, how? I said, we're going to ride in the rain. So I made him get on his bike, and we rode through 20 minutes of pouring rain to the other side of town.
So cool.
And we got there, and she wasn't home, just as he had predicted. And so we rode all the way back, but I felt like $1 million, right?
Yeah.
I was like, yeah, I'm doing it. I'm a missionary. Like I'm sacrificing for the gospel and going through the pain of that. So yeah, you kind of get cured a little of that zeal after a few weeks or months. You kind of, the practical realities settle in. You kind of understand better what it's like to be a missionary, and just kind of the low success rate that you typically have. But They call it the greedy enthusiasm. When you're very green, I don't know if that is a universal term to say someone's green.
Yeah, I know. I mean, yeah, I get the point.
Yeah.
Did you have any kind of more aggressive encounters? And then did you have encounters with Christians who knew their faith and were just waiting for a Mormon to knock on their door?
Oh, yes.
Sorry, LDS to knock on
Oh, no,
their
that's
door.
fine. Yeah. Oh, very much so. Yeah, especially in the South. You'd have, we would knock on the doors of Baptist pastors not infrequently. And some of them...
I'm sure you were afraid when you saw their excitement. Like, I had this one experience where I was taking a nap in San Diego. We used to live in San Diego. I was having a nap. And my wife knocked on the door just as I was getting ready to fall asleep. She went, "Honey, sorry to wake you up, but there's some Jehovah's Witnesses at the door." And she knew that would excite me. And I got up and I was so pumped. So I'm sure whenever you encounter people who are just too excited, you're like, back away.
No, I liked it.
Okay.
So I knew, like I said, I was a very studious kid. Mm-hmm. So I knew my scriptures pretty well. So the LDS ones, and I knew the New Testament, at least well enough, I would say. So I would say now that I did not truly know the New Testament, but I knew kind of like the LDS reading of the New Testament. I knew my proof texts. Mm-hmm. I knew the proof texts they would use. I knew my proof texts. And so I actually kind of enjoyed the tussle of getting into it. I mean, I'm sure I came across as the most impertinent, arrogant 20-year-old kid. You get this 40-year-old Baptist pastor who's been doing this for decades, and he's explaining things to me. And I was like, "No, you're wrong because of this scripture," right? And we'd kind of go back and forth. Mm-hmm. And we had some aggressive but respectful conversations. If it got to the point where people were being really rude, we would just stand up and leave.
Yeah.
Sometimes, a couple times I remember just walking out. I remember one time being, meeting with I think it was a pastor, and he said something extremely disrespectful. I won't even repeat. Mm-hmm. Like, it was so, the type of thing that I don't think you should ever say to anyone else about something they hold sacred, even if you think it's terrible. So we just stood up and walked out. And as we're walking down the street, he stood on his porch screaming at us as we walked down, yelling, "The devil can appear as an angel of light. Mm-hmm. The devil can appear as an angel of light." And let's just say...
He's not wrong.
He's not wrong. That's from the New Testament. Paul says that. But let's just say that that's not... it was not an effective way to reach us.
It was not conducive to helping us see the ways. Yeah.
We walked away just thinking like, what a moron.
Yeah. Well, if anything, it kind of confirms you. Yeah. And like what we're doing is the truth, and Christ said we'd be persecuted.
Absolutely. Yes. That very much happens.
Wow. Did you ever encounter... Yeah, it's difficult being part of I'm just thinking like sociological, right? Just thinking about being a part of a faith group. Like, what do you do when someone raises a question that you don't know how to answer? It's like, well, you don't worry, because you then ask people who are smarter than you, and you just hope that what they have to share with you will put you at ease. Mm-hmm. And honestly, I think when you're in the kind of like the enthusiasm of the faith, like you were, or like I was, even if no one has a satisfying answer, you just assume that it's out there, or you just brush it aside, or...
No, I had a few interactions on my mission that kind of shook me a little bit, right? I mean, I grew up in Orem, Utah. Everyone was LDS. When you're surrounded by that kind of cultural homogeneity, you don't really question very much. You kind of just think, like growing up, every now and then I would encounter what we were taught to think of as like anti-Mormon talking points. Yeah. Right. And they always seemed so ridiculous to me because they were so foreign to my experience. Right. And I was told that they were lies. Right. And so I'll give you an example of like a few things. I remember one time going to what we call general conference in the LDS faith. It's like twice a year, church members gather in Salt Lake City, and all the church leaders speak there. All the prophets and apostles and all that. It's a very big deal. And there's always people out there protesting. And I remember one time being there with some friends in high school, and one of them handed me this flyer. And I remember reading it out loud to them and just laughing. They're like, because it said on there, "Mormons believe that Adam is God," or something like that. So, I mean, fast forward, I kind of found out later that this actually used to be something that LDS prophets taught.
"I advanced a doctrine with regard to Adam being our father and God. It is one of the most glorious revealments of the economy of heaven." Brigham Young, 1861.
But at the time, I just thought, where do they get this stuff? Like, how ridiculous is that? When you go on a mission and you're encountering people, especially in the Bible Belt, some people at least know their faith well. not as many as is advertised. I remember in my mission, I used to joke, they call it the Bible Belt because most people have a Bible somewhere in their house. But every now and then you would encounter people who really knew their faith. In fact, I remember encountering a Catholic on my mission who challenged me on the LDS view of the fall of Adam and Eve. Because in LDS teaching, the fall is kind of seen as like a good thing, like something that God wanted to happen. It was part of his plan from the start. And there's a sense in which a Catholic can affirm that, like, God sees all from the beginning, all things are present to him at once. And so, in his providence, the fall is something that he knows about, right?
Oh, happy fault, which merited
happy fault that merited for so great a savior, as we say at Easter. And, but in the LDS sense, it was just sort of like, no, it was like a necessary thing. Like it had to be this way because this is like the eternal scheme of things that, we're premortal spirits that live beforehand, and God creates this new world and people have to come here. And the whole reason we're coming here is in order to have a mortal experience where we experience like the hardness and the harshness of life to help us grow and to become more godlike. And a necessary precondition of that is the fall. And so it sort of seems like a good thing. And I had a Catholic that I was, this is from door knocking, and he said something like, how could a good God command them to not do something that he kind of like secretly wanted them to do, Adam and Eve, right?
Yeah.
And it was like the first time I had a question I didn't have a ready answer for. I thought, I don't know. I don't know that. And for days, it just like bothered me, just kind of mulling it in my head,
I have another question as you're speaking. I'm thinking this through. So, and I don't want to get into the weeds here because I want to go the trajectory of your story, but am I right in thinking that Mormons believe that God, who we worship, who Mormons worship, was once a man?
So I'll give a qualified yes to that, and the qualification is this. It used to be totally yes. Like when I was growing up, that was talked about openly all the time. Okay. We had this little couplet. It was like, and this was taught by an LDS prophet, as God, as man is, God once was. Yeah. As God is, man may become. Yeah. And so totally that was the explicit teaching of Joseph Smith toward the end of his life, that God, and they still teach, it's in their scriptures, that God has a physical corporeal body, as tangible as man's, it says. Like the Father specifically has a body as tangible as man's. I would say that they don't emphasize that as much now as they used to. So I think some Latter-day Saints, if you were to ask them, would kind of give I don't know. Okay. If God was man the same way we were. Certainly plenty would still say yes. But go ahead.
Well, here's what I was going to say. I mean, if it's true that the Father was once a man like we are, and if sin is sort of a necessary condition to advance to godhood, wouldn't it follow that God was once a sinner?
No, not necessarily. No. It's not necessary that you sin, okay. But it sort of was necessary somehow that and they don't actually describe the fall as a sin. Okay. They use the word transgression, which I think is more like kind of King James language. Definitely LDS scriptures talk about like the transgression of Adam and Eve. And so it's almost presented, and some of this gets into like LDS temple theology.
Just want to back up. So would a Mormon who affirms that God the Father, whom Mormons worship today, if they affirm that he was once a man, would they say, but as a man he never sinned?
Yeah, well, Jesus was a man, but never sinned.
Yeah.
Right?
So, but I'm talking specifically about the Father.
Well, he could have been like that. That's what I'm saying.
It could have been like that, but it seems to me like you should get that right if you're going to say that God was once a man.
They would definitely say he could have been a sinner. I think that would not. Because they believe that... that every person can become like God the Father pretty much in all respects. Like God's nature in Mormonism is not different than ours. We have the exact same, we don't share one nature with him, like not in a Trinitarian sense, but we are the same kind of being as him. Exactly the same. Like there's no ontological difference between God and us. He is just this was Joseph Smith's later theology, he's a more progressed and advanced human, essentially.
If I'm getting into something you want to talk about later, just tell me, okay? But I guess the question I would have is if I were a Mormon and the Mormons around me say, well, look, we don't know. Like there's some mystery there. We don't know if God the Father was once a man, let alone whether he sinned. That's not something, fair enough. But if you've got the prophet, quote unquote, saying that that's the way things were, wouldn't that cause you some trouble? Like,
Yeah, it caused me a little trouble.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that's,
and then how did you deal with that? Maybe when that,
I think, so I'll say one thing about my mission
okay.
directly relating to this,
Yeah.
and then I'll talk about kind of how I dealt with it. So I talked about how growing up, I was exposed to these kind of things that I was told were anti-Mormon lies, right? Like, oh, you don't have to believe, don't worry about those things. Like, that's just a lie. Like,
you use the example of Adam being
I
God.
use the example of Adam being God, or like, say, even Joseph Smith practicing polygamy. Growing up, I was told that's just a lie. He didn't do that. Part of this was like, I was the last generation of Latter-day Saints that grew up pre-internet, or at the very, very beginning of the internet, right? Most Latter-day Saints now growing up, they all know that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy. The church is, and to their credit, is much more clear about its history than at least that I received growing up. But I was a very studious kid, and there were all sorts of things that I encountered. And when I would ask my leaders, they'd be like, no, that's a lie. Joseph Smith was never a Mason. That's a lie. Joseph Smith never practiced polygamy. That's a lie. We never taught that Adam was God. That's a lie. Those types of things. And then on my mission, I was in an apartment with some other missionaries, and one of them had a little kind of handbook of Mormon apologetics. And I've always been like a very voracious reader. So I grabbed it and I read it cover to cover, and it exposed me to a lot of these things. It was basically like, these things aren't lies. They actually are true.
And you've got a Mormon telling you it's
yes,
true.
Right.
It's not
along with apologetic responses of like, here's how you can
point.
Yeah, they concede the point, but then help you kind of like contextualize it and understand it. But that did rock me a little bit on my mission, because it was the first instance that I had where I realized that the LDS Church and history that had been presented to me as a kid might not be fully accurate, and that I might not always be able to depend on the church to give me like a full accurate account of its own history. But at the time, how did I deal with these things? Like, let's say, so like Brigham Young taught pretty forcefully that Adam was God the Father. They call it now the Adam God theory, although more properly I would say Brigham Young taught it as a doctrine. He'd be like, he put it as it was part of the temple ceremony. Like, he preached it from the pulpit. He said that man's salvation depends on him receiving this doctrine, right? And he was a prophet of the church. At the time, though, I think there's just was this kind of sense that like we are led by prophets today. As a Latter-day Saint, you believe that, like the guy today is the prophet. So like the most important thing is kind of like whatever's being said now is the most important thing. What happened in the past, they have this, they take this line from Isaiah that is in the King James Version is translated as like, I will give my people line upon line, precept upon precept. And in context, it's talking about kind of like God giving his law. But out of context, like that simple line gets picked up in the Book of Mormon and interpreted as sort of saying like God's pedagogy, right? He gives a little here, a little more, line upon line, precept upon precept. You kind of slowly progress to knowing more and more. And this is really central to LDS theology. So you can kind of say like, well, maybe the early Hebrews didn't really fully understand like the uniqueness of God, right? Like when God first revealed himself to them, he kind of seems to present himself as sort of like, I am the most powerful of all the gods. And then later you get to the point where they're like, there's really only one God, and it's our God. In the same way, maybe Brigham Young didn't really fully grasp everything. He kind of taught some wrong things, but now we're on track, or at least we're at the point where God wants us to be. Who knows what will happen in the future. So I think that's how I contextualized a lot of that stuff at the time.
Of course, the problem with it, of course, is because we believe in a gradual revelation in Christianity. Saint Athanasius knew more about the Trinity, presumably, than St. Peter did. There's a gradual understanding of what's being deposited, or even in the Old Testament, thinking about how God reveals himself as a Trinity, but not up front.
Yeah.
But the Christian response to that would be, yes, but none of this contradicts the previous thing. It is actually incremental in a way that doesn't contradict an earlier point.
Yeah.
Whereas in LDS, it seems like, no, there's a lot of contradictions here. So you would either have to say, and you correct me if I'm wrong, that God is just lying to people, or saying something that isn't true, or revealing something that's actually false to a prophet, because that's all you could handle right now, which seems really problematic. Or you just have to say that prophets can be dead wrong about doctrine, And given that you're calling him a prophet, that also seems really problematic.
Yeah, and I think that most Latter-day Saints would take the latter. Like, prophets can be really wrong. You know, I don't, if you know enough about the church's history, there's not really many other positions that you can take. Yeah. And the church kind of gestures at this. They'll say things like, don't follow dead prophets more than living prophets, kind of thing. You know, stick with the guy who's the prophet today.
So, I mean, obviously Catholics don't think the Pope is a prophet, but there's a similarity there, right? And there's sort of like guardrails set up so that when the Pope teaches in a certain way, using certain language, he binds the church to a certain thing.
Yeah.
So over the years then, has something like that emerged within Mormonism where it's like, no, it's not his personal opinion, it has to be very specific, or?
The only thing that I could think of would be they have an open canon. The LDS canon is open. So the prophet today could make an announcement that he's received a new revelation, and that this revelation is going to go in the church's canonical scriptures. I think that would be something more firm, but it almost never happens, right? The last time a revelation was added to the LDS scriptures was like in the early 1900s. Some people count the revelation the church received, quote unquote revelation to start allowing blacks to receive the priesthood in 1978. Some people say, well, that's the last one that's entered the canonical scriptures. Whether that's like, they call it a declaration. So whether it's a revelation or not, I think is a little iffy, but doesn't happen often. And in general, they're pretty willing to sort of be like, well, when he said that, he was just kind of speaking as a man, giving his best thoughts at the time. But yeah, I would agree. I think you have to accept that LDS prophets can teach something false when they're saying that they're teaching by revelation, which I think is a pretty sticky situation to be in.
And how did you deal with that?
Well, I didn't fully know at the time on my mission, right? I mean, I kind of knew, I think the apologetic book probably said I don't remember everything it said, but probably something like, hey, when Brigham Young was teaching this, he was just giving his opinion, right? And certainly, similar, like if the Pope's giving an interview just somewhere random, Catholics don't consider that like a binding declaration or him using like his highest magisterial office. In a similar way, if you can kind of pass it off as like, oh, Brigham Young was just being theologically speculative. And at the time, since I hadn't read any of the primary sources, I thought, okay, yeah, that I guess that makes sense to me. It's kind of weird that he would teach that, but it's not a crisis of faith.
Maybe poetic even. Like he meant what he said, but he meant it in more of a spiritual way.
Yeah, I mean, he didn't.
Yes.
But at the time, I kind of moved on that way and just thought, but it was a beginning of thinking like, oh, my faith is more complex than I thought. Some of that's just maturity, right? As a kid, if you grow up and you just kind of think everything that's taught you is true, and then as you become an adult, you kind of see how life is more complicated, including faith is a more complicated thing. But some of it too was just discovering more about Mormonism and the history. And I came back from my mission with a much more kind of complicated relationship. Still very much a believer, but no longer thinking that it was just a simplistic, obvious thing.
So you gave one example of the Catholic challenging you on the Mormon's understanding of the fall. Was there something else that you were challenged on that?
Not that I can recall off the top of my head. I'm sure there was, but
because I suppose if I'm a young adult missionary, I would just assume that I'm going to be told things, asked questions that I have no idea about or no idea how to respond to. So,
yeah, I guess I was more arrogant. Like,
oh, I got this in the bag.
I have answers. Like you ask me questions, I've got answers for you.
Is there a reason when you read that apologetic book that was written from a Mormon perspective to respond to arguments against Mormonism? You said that you came to think that maybe I can't trust the church to tell me the real history. Why didn't you just distrust the pamphlet? Why didn't you say, well, this Mormon
I think it was
has it wrong?
That's a good question. I mean,
it was probably footnoted, I presume.
Yeah, I mean,
it didn't look like it was.
It was written from a LDS believing perspective. Like, I think it was probably sold in like LDS bookstores, like church-owned bookstores, that sort of thing. There was just no reason to kind of think, oh, this guy's like pulling. And, I think partially too, like if someone, when you look at history, they talk about the criterion of embarrassment, right? Like if you share something that's embarrassing, you're more likely to be telling the truth. And so I think this, like what motivation would this person have to lie in this case, right? Like he's admitting uncomfortable things about LDS history. So,
and then seeking to defend
it. So I think in general, like in cases like that, obviously you shouldn't stake your whole spiritual life on something like that without checking sources. But, you kind of give this presumption of like, oh, if he's like admitting it, then probably it did happen,
Mm-hmm. Did you know of any Mormons who were kind of intelligent and knew the faith who started to question it?
Not at that time.
No.
Yeah. Okay. Not when I was a missionary.
So you came home, you say, with a more complicated...
Yeah. Well, and the other thing that happened on my mission was I got really sick. You mentioned at the beginning, you said that sounds exhausting. And I said it was. It was also very stressful. I mentioned like all the rules, right? It's like a very regimented, it's almost like religious life in some ways. Mm-hmm. And because LDS missionaries are young, very young, they're basically teenagers when they start. The church is very aware that young men need structure, mm-hmm. and they can do very dumb things. And so the regimented life has a very practical purpose. But for some missionaries like me, you can kind of become a slave to the rules. And you kind of think like, and some of this was the messaging they would give us, right? In order to like get us to actually do the things you're supposed to do, they like would harp very hard on like the importance of exact obedience. Mm-hmm. I remember multiple times hearing people say, we were supposed to be up at 6:30. And they would say, if you roll out of bed at 6:31 in the morning, the Holy Ghost will not be with you that day. Because like, if you're not obedient, why would the Holy Ghost be with a disobedient missionary? And I really took that to heart. So I kind of like was going through my mission like almost like a robot sometimes, right? Like, oh, we have to do this now. And we can't do this. We have to do that. And it really, first of all, it really hampered, contrary to the messaging I receive, it really hampered my success. Because as you can imagine, a lot of people are not attracted to someone who doesn't come across as human, right? I was kind of robotic, but it also just kind of really stressed me out. And about a year into my mission, over the course of like a month, I developed like 2 chronic health problems. One was a urinary problem, and it ended up being genetic, on that one. I ended up having surgery years later to correct it. But it was something that hadn't really manifested until then, where talking about urinary things sometimes seems embarrassing. It's not embarrassing to me, but like I had difficulty urinating, and it was like a constant. You know how you feel when you have to go to the bathroom really bad, like so bad it's painful. It felt like that 24/7. Yeah, like 24 hours a day. And I went to multiple doctors to get it treated. They gave me all sorts of medication. Nothing helped. I was misdiagnosed when I was on my mission. They didn't understand. I did have what's called an overactive bladder, but they totally misdiagnosed the cause, which was a genetic physical issue that needed correction. And they were just like, oh, you're probably just like eating too much spicy food or something, or you take this medicine, it'll go away. And it didn't. And it was just so painful. And then I also developed like a jaw pain. I don't know if you've ever known anyone who has like TMJ disorder or something like that. But your jaw, if it gets out of alignment, and I didn't know at the time, but I was like clenching and grinding my teeth really hard at night, just probably from the stress and that sort of thing. But it got so painful that there were times when I couldn't speak because it was just hurting so bad. I had like a 2-month period where I was on an all liquid diet because I couldn't chew even like soft pasta because the pain was like so intense. And I couldn't find, again, I really had a difficult time getting medical help on my mission. There was a doctor that we could call who like oversaw multiple missions, right? Like out in the East Coast. So I'd call him on the phone and I'd just be like, oh, it hurts really bad, my jaw and, and my bladder. And he would be like, oh, take some ibuprofen, So I would, but it wouldn't help. And, I went and saw a couple of doctors locally, but TMJ is a very difficult thing to treat. Most medical doctors, for whatever reason, don't do almost anything to do with the mouth or the face, right? They send you to dentists or other specialists to handle that area. So medical doctors are kind of like, I don't know what to do about your jaw. Go see a dentist. And most of the dentists would be like, oh yeah, I had a 1-day seminar on this like 2 years ago. Let me like do this thing, and then it wouldn't help, right? So I just was, and I had never experienced anything like this in my life. I had never suffered prior to this time. I was just like the total happy-go-lucky kid. And then on my mission, I kind of like got a little like obsessed with the rules. And then boom, this like double whammy in the course of like a month. I had these 2 health problems come up that basically I was in chronic pain for the next like 8 or 9 years, something like that.
Wow.
And so
that's got to be hard not to speak as a missionary. How did you deal with that? Were you shown compassion by your leaders that I can't go out today? I can't.
My mission lead, so we have a guy named a mission president.
Mm-hmm.
He oversees the whole mission. He was great. The level of compassion that I received from other missionaries varied a lot. I had one companion who was just like totally uncompassionate. You know, we'd be out walking and I'd just be like, I'm in a lot of pain today. And he would say, yeah, I bet complaining about it helps. I was like, okay, great. So this is what it's going to be like for a couple months, you know? And then I had others who were much more compassionate and that sort of thing. It was just hard. I mean, I remember we had this family we were teaching that we got really close to. And one of them said something like, you know, Elder Hess just hardly ever says anything, right? Like he's so quiet. And I don't know if you can tell, I love to talk. I'm a talkative guy. And I just remember that made me so depressed, right? I just thought, yeah, I'm quiet because like it hurts so bad to speak that I won't speak. I lost a bunch of weight because I wasn't eating very much, you know. I should have gone home. But the pressure to not go home early was so high. And I wanted to stay, right? It's not just that it was pressure. I'm saying that someone should have told me, hey, you need to go home. And I would have argued against them. And then I would have gone home.
Did you tell your parents what was happening?
Yeah. They knew about it. I don't know if they knew the full degree, you know. Communication is very limited as a missionary. Like we could only write home. We couldn't call.
Okay.
And we only wrote home once a week. But you know, I kind of told them about it. Anyway, so that was kind of like, that also changed me a lot, as you can imagine. Like I came home having suffered and still suffering. I came home really sick. And so I was a very different person after my mission.
It sounded like you changed partners several times. I didn't realize that. I thought you were just with someone and that was it for the year or something. No. So on a mission, we measured time by what we called transfers. A transfer was every 6 weeks. And so you kind of measure your mission in 6-week increments. Every 6 weeks, you might get moved and your companion might get moved. It just depends on what the mission president wants to do, where he wants everyone to go. So I was in my first area for 2 transfers, so about 3 months, with 2 different, maybe 3, but with 2 different companions. And then I went to another area where I had a different companion. So I probably had a total of like 10 companions on my mission. And are you staying
overall.
in like houses or apartments? Or are you staying with...
or houses, yeah, both. Yeah, with other missionaries.
So did you ever share your questions or concerns about things that were brought up to you? Like, I hope this is true. I'm feel a little frazzled by this question this Catholic posed to me. Or did you have someone share stuff like that with you?
No. No, I never shared it. No, I wanted to be the guy who had the answers. You know, I didn't want to be the one with the questions.
Okay. So coming home.
Coming home. I got home. I went back to BYU. I'd been there for a year, and I thankfully was properly diagnosed after I got home on both my health issues. But the treatment for the bladder problem can cause infertility. And so, I elected, under strong advice from the doctor, which ended up being good advice, not to do anything about that for a time. He gave me some medication that did actually help. After a proper diagnosis, he's like, this will improve your symptoms a little. And it did. The jaw thing, I spent, and we'll kind of get into this later because I had a beautiful experience later on that kind of led to that being healed. But, I went and saw so many specialists that tried everything they could think of, but it was just pain all the time. You get used to it after a while of being in pain every day. But yeah, I went back to school. I met my wife about a year after I got back from my mission. And, we had a very fast, but at the time kind of standard length LDS courtship and marriage. We met in the summer and got married at Christmas.
Love it. I'm a fan.
Yeah. When you know, right? And yeah, we just started our lives together. She had just graduated. When we got married, she graduated as a nurse from BYU. And I was a English major, English literature. And yeah, we just kind of started living our lives in Provo. I got a job working full time while I was still in school at a software company, doing like customer support. And that kind of triggered most of my later career. I'm a software engineer now. And so we just kind of were living our lives. And that was kind of about the time where I really started to have cracks form in my faith.
How did that happen?
So I think Stephen, I can't remember when you had your earlier guest that you mentioned. So there was a book that came out, a biography of Joseph Smith, came out in the early 2000s, right around this time, I think maybe it was 2005, like right around the time I came home from my mission. It was called Rough Stone Rolling. And it was written by a faithful church member who's a professional historian. He's a professor of history at like Columbia or something like, some prestigious university, LDS guy. And he kind of wrote the biography with the blessing of the church. So when the internet goes big, everyone has access to all the information. And so the kind of very, standardized account that I'd been given as a kid, and even the author of this book, whose name is Richard Bushman, he like has this famous quote that people bandy about where he says something like, the narrative that we all grew up with can't hold because it's simply not true, right? It's like, we have to be more honest about our history. So he wrote this book. I remember being at BYU and just hearing people talk about it. It's kind of like this thing like, have you read this? Have you
were
read
they
this?
shaken by it? Or
Oh yeah, a lot of people were shaken by it. Yeah, because it was definitely written from a faithful perspective, a believing perspective. But it, to the book's credit, to the church's credit, it deals with all the messiness of Joseph Smith's life.
Yeah.
It just lays it all out there. And, the book gestures often to sort of like ways that a faithful Latter-day Saint could understand these things. It's not a book of apologetics, although it has a lot of kind of apologetical impulses in the way it tells the story. It wasn't published by the church, but it was sold in all the church's bookstores. So it kind of had this like tacit stamp of approval, like it's okay to read this. Because growing up, we were always told like stay away from anti-Mormon sources and anti-Mormon literature. So we were kind of like, well, we can trust this. The church sells it. And so I was kind of afraid to read it, right? Because I would hear people read it. I heard of people like, oh, they read this and they left, like Mormonism.
Well, just to offer an analogy, sorry if it's annoying that I keep doing this, but I keep trying to apply my experience to your experience, right? And I say like, okay, well, in the church, right, we had this big sex abuse crisis.
Yes.
Where we have a lot of homosexual priests who are doing evil things with younger boys. And I'm sure when that first came out, it was like, this didn't happen. Like, this is probably just a tax, and you should expect that, right?
Right.
I don't personally remember people saying that, but obviously Catholics were saying that. Same thing is true if you have the head of a religious order, like the Legionaries of Christ, turn out to be a psychopath or something. Maybe not a psychopath, but
the impulse
really
originally,
bad guy.
the initial impulse is like, no, that's false.
Yes.
That's lies.
But then you actually have great respect when someone says, well, look, I'll show you just how confident in my faith I am by exposing the dirt to you. I mean, that really is a good thing, because if you're not doing it, it's going to come out.
Oh, yeah. And the church recognized that, right? Which is one of the reasons why I think they kind of, I don't know, I used to know more in detail what the relationship between the church and Bushman was during the production of this. But I think at a minimum, they were very encouraging. They were sort of like, the church has your back here.
Yep.
Write this book and produce it. We need something like this to exist.
Right. We're confident in our faith. We don't want it to seem as if we're hiding anything.
And there were, and I have met people who have read this book and say, it strengthened my faith, right? But for me, so all I can do is speak to my own experience, because I know a lot of people kind of scoff, like, oh, if Rough Stone Rolling shook your faith, you never really believed or whatever, which is silly.
Gaslighting.
But, yeah. When I read my first attempt to read it was sometime, during this time, within a year or two of being married. And I only made it through the first few chapters before I just had to stop, because I couldn't do it.
Now, there are those who are watching who don't know what we're talking about. So could you give us some examples that were outlined in the book or told about in the book?
So the beginning of the book tells the early part of Joseph Smith's life. And growing up, I had been taught like a very kind of hagiographic view of Joseph Smith's life, just like everything about, he was just like this holy young boy. We were given a few anecdotes of his childhood that kind of just, he was very saintly. Right. They used to tell us this story, I'm sure they still do, about how he had a bone infection as a young boy. And he had to have surgery to have that infected part of the bone chipped out. And this is in the early 1800s. So you can imagine just how painful that would be. So the story we were told was, he was offered liquor as like a sedative, right? Drink this, you'll want to. And he refused, right? He said, no, if my father will hold me in his arms, that will be enough, or something like that. It's a really beautiful story. I don't know how historical it is. I know he did have the surgery. I just haven't looked into it. It could very well be true. Those are the kind of stories we heard about Joseph Smith. In this book, the very beginning, it tells a very different story, or additional stories about how Joseph Smith was very involved in folk magic and like magical treasure seeking as a young kid. And this was very common in rural America during this time. Like rural America brought from Europe all these kind of like superstitious magical beliefs that carried on in the rural parts of the country for a very long time. So it was not uncommon, there's even these great quote by Ben Franklin, like 100 years before, or 50 years before Joseph Smith or so, talking about how like in the countryside, everyone's like obsessed with finding treasure, and they like contact spirits and things like that and perform all these rituals in order to do so. So Joseph Smith, when he was a teenager, was what's known as a scryer. He had what he said was a magical stone that he could peer at, and through the stone, he could see. It was like a seer stone, they call it. He could see things that other people couldn't see. And specifically what he could see is the location of treasure. And so people would hire him to find lost things. But specifically, they would hire him to find treasure because they were all obsessed with getting rich, right? So they would go on these big treasure digs, and this is very well documented. Joseph Smith went on a number of these through his teenage years. And he wasn't the only scryer in his town. There were other scryers who could see in stones. And he would go out there and they would dig holes in the ground, and he would kind of be like, okay, yeah, this is where it is. And these are the things we have to do. There's usually like a guardian spirit that was controlling the treasure. And so this is what we have to do to either trick the spirit or convince him to let us have the treasure. And then as they're digging, it would be like, we did it wrong. The treasure is sinking into the earth, right? And then it would be a failure. They never found treasure on any of Joseph Smith's digs. And this was illegal. It was so known as like a con. It was a con, basically, that it was against the law to do this.
He's presumably being paid.
Yeah, he's being paid. Yeah. He was actually taken to court as a young man. There's the court documents exist where he was taken to court and fined as a glass looker, they called it, like someone who looked in these stones. And first of all, that's like a really weird thing to read about your religious founder. You're like, well, what the heck was he involved? And you can kind of contextualize it in his time and place. Like this wasn't that unusual, but it gets uncomfortable when you realize how close that story mimics the finding of the Book of Mormon, which was a golden book buried in the ground with a spirit associated with it, which Joseph Smith located using his stone, and you're kind of like, well, now this starts to feel really strange to me, like it used to feel the story growing up, I felt kind of very biblical, like angels appearing to people, telling them what to do. But now it feels very kind of folk magic-y, right? So that's the kind of thing, right? You read in the early parts of the book and you're kind of like, yikes, like, so I had to stop reading. Does that give you a good example?
Yeah.
of the type of thing?
Yeah. Wow. And then I suppose it got into his polygamy. It probably got into the gun battle at his death.
Yeah, I didn't read that part yet. At that time, I was still... So I was like really kind of shaken by that experience of kind of even just starting that book.
So what did you do with that shakenness? Who did you go to help?
Oh, no one. Yeah.
Why?
I don't know. It felt too dangerous in some ways to even like think about it. I had like a lot of blocks in my mind, just sort of like, I don't want to lose my faith. I don't want anything to like challenge this thing that I love. And so I just don't want to think about this.
Which is funny because I think if I encountered something similar about atrocities that members of the church have committed or things a pope did, and if it shook my faith, I think the first thing I would do is, since I love my faith and since I believe it to be true, I would seek to have those tensions eradicated by going to people smarter than me
Yeah.
who can help me navigate.
Yeah.
That's exactly what I would do.
And I did do that later.
Okay.
But at this time, I didn't do anything. I don't remember if I
We-
even talked to my wife about it at that time.
Were you afraid of maybe seeming like a doubter?
Yes. Oh,
Yeah.
very much so.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And I was, at the time I was serving. So, in the LDS Church, you get what's called a calling, basically an assignment to do something, to serve in some way in your local ward, your congregation. And so I was serving as the young men's president. So like the leader of all it was kind of like being a youth minister at the time. So there's also the sense of like, I have like important thing that I'm in charge of. And like, I can't spend my time doing this.
Mm-hmm.
I have to like help these young people and that sort of thing.
That makes sense.
So a few years later, I went to graduate school at the University of Iowa. So we moved out there, and this would have been in 2010. And so once again, I was kind of outside of the Utah bubble, right? And encountering other people who were not religious, people who were, Christian, but not LDS, and made some good friendships, and people who were like really like asking me and kind of challenging me about my faith. And I just thought, I need to read. I need to stop being afraid of the truth, right? Like, and so I decided to like buckle down and read all of Rough Stone Rolling, right, from beginning to end. And he's like, even if it bothers me, like, I have to know this, right? How can I talk about my faith if I'm too afraid to even learn about it?
Mm-hmm.
So I read the book cover to cover, and the whole thing kind of proceeded as the beginning in my mind, like seeing Joseph Smith. There are a lot of, he was an impressive figure in many ways, right? He started this like worldwide religious movement. So there were a lot of things that were kind of like, wow, that's neat, that's cool, things I didn't know.
Mm-hmm.
But there were also so many things just from the beginning to the end of his life that really made me question whether or not he was a prophet. And now, of course, this is 2010, right? So we're well past the beginning of the internet. And now I can like dig into all sorts of sources, like, defenses, like there's online apologetics ministries in the LDS faith, just like you have in Catholicism. So I would read like what critics would say, and I would read the responses from apologists, and I would read the responses to the responses, just because I wanted to get a sense of the different positions in the debate, right? To try to kind of understand what the truth was, But like starting around that time, my faith was kind of wounded in a way that it just didn't recover from eventually, It still was many years, 8 more years or so before I really did much about it. But starting around 2010 was when I first really contemplated leaving Mormonism. And it was the first when I really started talking to my wife about it too.
It must have been a lonely time.
It was very lonely. Yeah.
Yeah, to go through something that's that important to you without having a confidant or somebody to help guide you through it.
Yeah. Yeah. It was not easy, and I really loved the church. Like it worked for me, and it was such an important part of my life and my history. And so it was also just really painful for, I kind of like was desperate to hang on to it at the same time. So
yeah,
I met with some of my church leaders at that time. So I did talk to my wife about it. It's kind of like, I read this book, I'm having these doubts. I don't really know what to do about that. And she was really supportive, she was like, oh, let's find you some help. Let's figure this out or whatever. And so I met with some of my church leaders and kind of expressed some of the questions that I had. And they kind of just gave very kind of generic advice, like, focus on like the good parts of the faith and kind of rely on that personal testimony that you have, right? Like you've had all these good experiences. The Holy Spirit has told you it's true. Kind of like, don't worry so much about that, and there wasn't really like any specific defense that I was looking for. I mean, I was familiar with all of the arguments on both sides. It wasn't like, they could have said like, well, have you considered? It's like, well, yes, I've considered. Like, yeah, I know what this side says. I know what this side says. And I'm kind of stuck in this tension.
Okay. Yeah. And you didn't think to yourself, like, what could have been a way forward for you? Because I hear you saying that you wanted to cling to what had so many good elements, that it worked for you. What was the most plausible way forward? Was it to say, all right, men are sinners and I can accept that and I can still hold on to my Mormon faith? You know, like
Yeah,
what was?
I think so. A lot of Latter-day Saints, and I did this too in my mind, kind of boil down a lot of the issues with sort of that. Well, people are sinners. Nobody's perfect.
Yeah, and you could also say, okay, well, Joseph Smith was a sinner in his youth, and maybe like the Lord revealed the truth of Mormonism
Through
in a
this
way,
method,
through a method that he had learned.
And that's a lot of the like way the apologists will say. It's like, it's sort of like, I think Bushman, the one who wrote Rough Stone Rolling, coined the phrase, like, it was almost like a preparatory gospel for him. Like it put him in like a frame of mind, so that he would be open to kind of receiving the later revelation that God gave to him.
Why wasn't that enough? Was it just that there were multiple?
Yeah, it's just there was just too much.
Away
I think
it wasn't the one.
Like, it wasn't just like, oh, Joseph Smith did this thing. In fact, when I really got down to like my faith transition and kind of like the faith crisis that I went through, I tried really hard in my mind to extract away sort of like the foibles of Joseph Smith or other prophets, because it's just true that God uses imperfect people. He does it in the Old Testament, he does it in the New Testament, he does it today. And so just because someone had this history, or just because someone made these mistakes or committed these sins, even if they have positions of authority and a high calling from God, it doesn't necessarily mean that what they've taught is false. And so I tried to actually like sequester those things as much as I could. No one's perfect. No one's like, I'm not a computer, but I wanted to focus on like the core issues, like, are the teachings true? And how can I know that? Right. And I do want to get into that in a little bit, like at the proper point in the story, if that's all right.
Yeah.
But yeah, at the time, so I remember at that time when we were living in Iowa in grad school, I had this experience. My wife and I were sitting up one night talking about all this stuff, right? And it wasn't a good conversation. Like, it was very hard for my wife to talk about this and to kind of hear me express all these doubts. And, she had all these fears about, this was right around the time when she became pregnant with our oldest child. And she, I don't know, it's totally understandable.
It's completely understandable.
So hard
any good wife would have those fears and anxieties. I mean, goodness, how would I feel if tomorrow night my wife sat me down and said she's having deep doubts about the Catholic faith? What does that mean for my children? What does that mean for our marriage? I mean, it's a completely reasonable response.
So we had this night where we were having this conversation, hard conversation. She kind of leaves, I think, like in tears, you know what I mean? Goes to bed. And I was sitting on our couch in our living room in this apartment that we were living in.
And you're like, a beer would be so good right now.
I didn't think that at the time. Okay. But, I just thought, and I was just sitting there just feeling despair, just total despair. And, at the time too, like I had what seemed to me like a viable alternative, right? I didn't really know where this was leading, but there wasn't the sense in my mind like, okay, if this not true, maybe that, like, it was just this, or it seemed like nothing, right? And I was sitting on this couch and I had what I can best describe as like a vision almost. I didn't see anything with my eyes. It was all in my mind. Like I totally know that it was all in my mind, but it was so vivid that it was like, it was using like the capacity of my sight. And it was like I could see myself standing on this cliff, and I looked over the edge. I was like kind of peering over the edge, and it was like, that's where I was going, right? With like my doubts or whatever. And at the bottom was just this total sea of just nothingness that was like ready to swallow me whole. And it frightened me. Like this experience scared me so much. I was like, it was terrifying to think that like I might be jumping into this abyss. And I really recoiled from that. And that experience kind of like put me back in Mormon mode, you know what I mean? For quite some time. Because I was like, I don't want to go to nothing. Like if the option is Mormonism or nothing, I choose Mormonism, like I know this, it's good. There's a lot of goodness here. And so I that kind of kept me in for quite some time, even with my doubts, kind of having this almost like vision-like experience.
And what happened with your conversations with your wife at that point? They
ended up just kind of stalling out. You know what I mean? Like you can only talk about that so many times, and I wasn't ready to do anything about it, really. And so I was just kind of like, well.
And still at this point in your journey, you don't know other Mormons who are having the same questions, the same fears?
So there are other people who are, I didn't know at the time, but my brother, my oldest brother, was kind of on his way out of the church at this time. But I wasn't really aware of that. And I think a lot of Latter-day Saints at that time were having that same kind of experience, but like we're so afraid to talk to each other about it, right? Like a lot of people were just suffering in silence and just very lonely, like you said.
Because how is doubt viewed in the LDS community? In Catholicism, of course, Aquinas will talk about the sin of doubt, but that being like an intentional rejection of what God has revealed, perhaps, something like that, right? But as far as like fleeting emotional things, all human beings have them. So,
well, you're supposed to know, right?
Okay.
You're supposed to know that it's true.
Yeah.
The Holy Spirit told you. And so to doubt.
And that's so much pressure to put on a person.
Yeah, there's a lot of, it's viewed very negatively. Less so now, right? Like the church has now gone through kind of this like 20-year process of a lot of people leaving the church. And so there's a lot more compassion and understanding around people who have questions and doubt than there was then. But like if someone opens up to you that they're having questions, like it feels very dangerous to you. Like it's almost like a disease. You don't want to be infected by it, right?
Okay.
And so
I would not say that is the case in Catholicism.
I would agree.
Yeah.
My experience in general of Catholicism with a lot of these things was very different. Yeah. So that was kind of all going on, and I was still, so this is like 2011 now, something like that. I'm kind of nearing the end of my first year of graduate school, and I had this another kind of pivot point in my life where I had to decide what I was going to do during my summer. It was a 2-year program, and I had to do some kind of internship for the summer. And I had 2 options in front of me. And one of them was a very kind of like high intensity internship in downtown Chicago, and kind of seemed exciting, would be fun. But I was really worried that my health would not allow me to be successful at that, because I was still dealing with chronic pain every day. It very much affected my life, And then I had another offer to do an internship, basically to like stay on campus for the summer and do academic research with a professor, which was interesting to me. It didn't seem quite as cool, but it certainly seemed more relaxing, right? I wouldn't have to go anywhere. I could kind of just take the summer off, do a few hours. And I was really wrestling in my heart about like which one of these things to choose. And in LDS culture, there's a very strong, sense of, what we would probably call discernment. In Catholicism, they would refer to as personal revelation, like God speaking to you directly. And so I did what an LDS person does, and I like went to the temple, to the LDS temple, to like pray about this, about what I should do. And so I went to actually a very significant temple in LDS history called the Nauvoo Temple. It's located in one of the place where Joseph Smith was killed. It's like where the Latter-day Saints lived at that time. It's in Illinois. So I was in that temple praying really earnestly about this question. And I had what I think up until that time was probably the most significant spiritual experience of my life, where I'm going to sound like such a charismatic with some of these stories. I'm really not, like in my my day-to-day life, but I've had some of these experiences, And I was just in the holiest room in the temple called the celestial room. It's kind of supposed to represent being in the presence of God and being in heaven. And I was probably there for like hours praying about this, agonizing over it, and just agonizing about my health, right? Like, what am I going to do? Like, what kind of life can I live with these health problems? What is my life going to be like? Am I going to be able to support my family? Am I going to be able to be the provider I need to be? All these things. And after like a long time in prayer, I had this like instantaneous experience where like it was like a message was implanted right in my mind. It's so clear. Again, I didn't hear it, but I knew exactly the words that came with the message. And the message was, don't worry, you will have a normal life. And just like from head to toe, I just felt this like peace wash over me. And that might sound really like a strange message to a lot of people. Like a normal life might sound really unambitious. But when you've already been like having chronic pain for like 6 years or something like that, or 7 at that point, like that was like all I wanted. You know, I remember I just broke down in tears. I was just like, oh, a normal life. Like that's all I've ever wanted. And I remember just driving home, just like pouring out my thanks to God, just like, I just felt this total confidence. And in many ways, that was kind of like the experience that I'd always wanted to have about like, is Mormonism true? You know? Cause like, I remember just driving home, just feeling like totally just like God's got my back. Like this disease will not define my life. I can accept that internship in Chicago and I'll be okay. And so I did, and I got through it. I was still in pain that whole time. But about a year, so then I finished graduate school, and because of that internship, I got a job in Cincinnati, and I moved there. And when I first got there, pretty soon, you know, people found out I had this like really bad jaw problem. Like I went to a dentist when I got there, and I was like, oh yeah, I have this terrible jaw pain. And they said, oh, you should go see this doctor. He's a specialist.
By that point, are you sick of hearing
I was
recommendations?
so sick of it, right?
I get it, yeah.
You know, I'd been to so many specialists for jaw pain, and they had honestly messed up my mouth terribly. Like, yeah, had made it way worse. So I was just like, yeah, no, I'm not going to see anybody. And then I had a second person, you know, a month later, he's like, have you heard of this doctor? You know, you should go see him. He like specializes in that. I thought, nah, I'm not going to do it. Anyway, after like the fourth person over the couple of months, it's like, you should go see this guy. His name was Dr. Okeson at the University of Kentucky. So that was, no one had told me that he was actually at the university. I had dealt with quacks, you know, like what I consider quacks. But this doctor was like so I started Googling him, and I found out that he is actually like one of like the world authorities on this problem. And he was like half hour from my house.
Wow.
Right.
Yeah.
Like what? So I remember I called this office. I said, hey, you know, do you have any openings for me to come and see Dr. Okeson? You know, he has a clinic at the university. And they said, well, normally we're booked out like 6 months, but we actually had a cancellation. You could come in tomorrow if you want. And I was like, oh, sure. And they're like, keep in mind, our appointments can run up to 8 hours because people fly in from all over the world to see him. And so we have to get your whole issue resolved in one visit. That's like we try to get it all resolved in one visit.
That sounded great too.
Yeah, I was like, sure, I'll take a day off of work to come see him. We'll just see. And in one visit, he cured my jaw pain.
How? That's wonderful.
Yeah, properly he diagnosed it first. Most of the doctors before thought it was a joint problem. So I had been suggested to have surgery on my jaw like a dozen times.
And you didn't?
No.
Thank goodness.
No, because I like to look things up myself, and I saw like, it's kind of like back surgery, right? It's like often causes more problems than it solves. And so I'd never done that. He, in like an hour, determined it was just muscular pain. Like I was just having like constant muscle spasms due to like my teeth clenching that I did at night. So he gave me just like a special device to wear at night. He's like, if you wear this at night, it will relax your jaw. And I remember, and I was so skeptical. Yeah. I thought, yeah, whatever.
8 hours and I'm walking home with this little rubber thing for my mouth.
Yeah, walking home with this, it was hard. It wasn't rubber. It was, you know, it was acrylic.
What is it? Is it a tooth thing?
Yeah, you kind of just fit it over your front teeth. You know, so I had worn so many different appliances in my, like while sleeping, and none of them had done anything except they had protected my teeth, so I didn't grind them off, but none of them had done anything for the pain. But he was just like, no, just wear this at night. Your pain will go away. And I was like, whatever, you know. So, but I went home that night, I popped it in, and like, I will never forget what it felt like when I woke up the next morning.
Kidding.
Like I woke up and the pain was gone. And my jaw was like, I could move it, you know? And I just thought, what? How is this possible? You know?
And something so simple, it's almost infuriating that no one told you to do it sooner.
I know, it's ridiculous. It's just, it was just amazing. You know, it was just instantaneous relief.
I hope you called him and thanked him.
I don't know.
You better do that.
I think I had a follow-up.
Yeah.
You know, I think I went back and was just like, it's better, you know? So, yeah. And I really felt like that, especially like that experience I had praying in the LDS Temple, kind of like started a series of cascading events that led me to like being right next to this one doctor who like knew exactly what to do, and it just solved the problem. And, you know, I still struggle with like teeth clenching at night, and sometimes it gets a little sore, but it's just not even close to what it used to be.
I'm so
like
happy
it was
to hear
basically
it.
Better.
Yeah.
So, and I also around that time also had surgery on my bladder, which solved that problem. So
wow. Now, I mean, when people are in pain, they can become depressed. Because I know you say that you learn to live with the pain, but sometimes you just start shutting down in other areas.
Yeah.
Did you ever consider that maybe the reason you were becoming skeptical of Mormonism may have been because you were depressed, and now that God had freed you from this, I'm doing my best here, that maybe you could give kind of Joseph Smith and the LDS another shot? I mean, I know you hadn't abandoned it at this point.
I mean, I was still LDS. I didn't really, I mean, it certainly didn't solve my questions or my doubts.
Fair enough,
so
yeah.
I don't think that was it. I really think it was just a lingering sense of like, I just don't know if I believe this is true. And
I got to tell you guys about my new favorite app. It's called Ascension, and it's by Ascension Press. This is the #1 Bible study app, in my opinion. And you can go to ascensionpress.com/Fradd. Go there, and so that way they know that we sent you. It is absolutely fantastic. It has the entire Bible there, very well laid out. The whole Bible is read to you by Father Mike Schmitz, or just sections of the Bible. It has the catechism there. It's cross-referenced absolutely beautifully. It's really actually quite difficult to explain to you how good this is. Just download it and check it out for yourself. It even has over 1,600 frequently asked questions about Scripture. So if you go to Genesis 1, you might have a question about evolution. Well, there's a drop down right there. You can read an article that'll help you understand it. I went through it with the guys at Ascension the other day, and my jaw was just, it was dropped. It was absolutely amazing. It's had tens of thousands of 5-star reviews. Again, go to ascensionpress.com/Fradd. It also has all of their amazing Bible studies. So I remember back in the day, I had a big DVD case of Jeff Caven's Bible studies. Well, it's all there on the app. So go download it right now. Please go to ascensionpress.com/Fradd. All right, so yeah. 2012, I was saying the internet's obviously in full swing. You can not only look up anything about your own faith that you want to, but you could also look into other faiths, maybe see what objections they have.
Yeah. At
that point, as you were beginning to have doubts about Mormonism, was there anything at all that was more attractive?
No. I, as a Latter-day Saint, you're taught that you are in the true faith, and all the other faiths are wrong, and you kind of you're given just enough like superficial exposure to other faiths that you kind of feel like, I know about that. Yeah. I know that's not true.
It's probably true of all religions.
It's not true of all.
No,
I don't think so. I think that whenever,
not that all faiths are false. Like, it's very clear to me ever since I've been a serious Catholic that there was obviously some people are closer to the truth than others. It's not like we're right and everyone else is wrong. It's like, well, we have the fullness of what God wants for his people, and others approximate that. Yeah. And then some have complete perversions of it. But I think I think all of us, we don't have time. Yeah. No one has time.
You don't have time
to investigate the claims of all other religions. Therefore, it's necessary, if you're going to interact with it in any kind of way, to have some idea so that you can put that away.
Yeah. But I think that like some faiths, and Catholicism is one of these, that sort of teaches like, even if other religions have truth and approximate the truth, like we have the fullness, right? Like we're the one.
Yep.
You should join us. I think there's a tendency to kind of become very all or nothing about your faith, because you've been told in a way that, like, say, if you're evangelical, if you might think, well, maybe I could become Presbyterian or Anglican someday. It wouldn't feel like such a crisis to do that. Whereas to like leave Mormonism or Catholicism, it's very totalizing in your mind.
Yeah.
And so I didn't, and we'll get into this because then something does come on my radar that, but at this time there was nothing. And then I should just mention too, this is when our first daughter was born, was when we lived in Kentucky. She was born at a Catholic hospital in now I can't remember what city in Kentucky, but I remember she was born on Christmas Eve. And my mother-in-law when we were arriving at the hospital, was very concerned that there was no baby Jesus in the nativity display. She's like, someone stole baby Jesus. And I said, no, I think this is a Catholic hospital. I think they put baby Jesus there at midnight or something.
Yeah.
She's like, no, someone stole baby Jesus. Anyway, so she was very relieved the next day when baby Jesus was there. Yeah.
I know I asked Stephen this, but are Mormons baptized as babies? They're not, are they?
Right. Starting at 8 years old.
Is there some kind of dedication or something? I guess I'm trying to get
you have we call it a baby blessing.
So what was that like at this point? Having your children blessed. I mean,
you're
open to that. You weren't so.
Oh, absolutely. No, I totally was participating. Actually, when we lived in Kentucky, we were on the Kentucky side of the river outside Cincinnati. I was once again young men's president, leading all the young men in the ward and that sort of thing. No, the baby blessing was beautiful. Like, it's a great event. You get together with family and all the men, because, in the LDS Church, all the men are priests. And they have what they call the priesthood, sort of seen a little different than in the Catholic Church in some ways, but everyone can act priestly. And so all the men kind of stand in a circle holding the baby, and as the baby's dad, I give the blessing.
That's lovely.
And I kind of just say like whatever words come to my heart, to like give the child. You kind of like formally give it a name. So it's kind of like a christening in some ways. Like I give you a name and a blessing, and you kind of bless them for their life. So yeah, it's really beautiful.
All right.
Yeah.
Let's get to cracking
Let's
point.
do it. So I moved home. Well,
Home to Utah?
home to Utah. Yeah. We moved back after a year in Cincinnati. I loved Cincinnati. I hated my job. So a year later, I had an opportunity to go back to Utah. So we did. And so it was around this time that I was introduced to Eastern Orthodoxy, just online. So I used to read Rod Dreher. You're familiar with him?
Yeah.
And he was Orthodox, and
He converted from Catholicism.
Yeah. But at this time he was Orthodox, right?
Okay.
And I had never really encountered Orthodoxy before. I had heard of it, right? You kind of grow up. Like, I'd watched My Big Fat Greek Wedding.
So I pretty much knew most of what I needed to know. Yeah.
But I just thought, well, this is interesting. Here's an ancient faith that claims to be the true faith and has carried it forward since the time of Christ, but they're not Catholic, right? Because I had like a lot of anti-Catholicism just kind of imbibed from my LDS upbringing, and because they're the apostate faith. They ruined everything. That's why the restoration through Joseph Smith was necessary. And so this like really intrigued me, and it was very beautiful. I was very attracted to the beauty, right? Like that I would see. So like Dreher's blog was not about Orthodoxy, but it came through. He's a very open person. Yeah, he probably shares too much. But I just remember just thinking like, this is so beautiful. And so it kind of became like my hobby, this side interest I had. Like I would buy icons, and I bought an Orthodox study Bible, and I just kind of liked learning about it,
Is that how you justified your interest in it while remaining a Mormon?
Yeah. And I was still having more and more doubts. So at this time, my oldest brother,
I got to put this out. This is getting
too much.
Crisis level.
My oldest brother left Mormonism, and that was kind of like a crisis in some ways. It's like, whoa, like my own family, like what's going to happen to us?
What did he leave it for?
Nothing. Yeah. Just, kind of like a rationalist humanism, I would say. And he was pretty antagonistic with the church, and I was really struggling with my own doubts, but I still really, really wanted to be LDS. And so this was really hard for me, but it kind of, I don't know, there's just a lot of internal struggles going on. And this was right around the time when certain, definitely what I would call anti-Mormon efforts were kind of ramping up, of like people who'd left Mormonism and wanted to compile like all the issues with Mormonism into like certain documents, and people were sending them around to each other. Like, have you read this? Have you seen these things?
This is in the Mormon community.
In the Mormon community. Yeah. And so it was like a difficult time. So I was like kind of interested in Orthodoxy, still LDS.
How was your wife feeling about the icons coming into the house?
Not comfortable, I wasn't like doing a lot of like devotional stuff with them. Every now I did buy that little red prayer book, one, the Antiochian one. And every now and then I would like say morning and evening prayer from that. And I just thought it was beautiful, So this went on for a couple of years, where I was just kind of like, I always describe it as just kind of up and down with my faith. I would go through periods where I would just feel totally at peace with being Mormon. And I just loved it. It's like when I focused on the parts that I liked, it was good. It's good community, good values, meaningful experiences, great. And then anytime I was kind of forced to confront my doubts, parts about things in LDS history, or things about, like, say, the Book of Mormon, or other things that Joseph Smith produced that made me question, then I would kind of plunge into this like deep spiritual turmoil, sometimes for months on end, So it was not a stable way to live. And so around this time, my wife was pregnant with our second daughter, and she was 35 weeks pregnant, and we went into the doctor for a routine checkup, and there was too much amniotic fluid. Like her amniotic fluid levels were too high. And so they said, hey, you should go see a specialist, like a neonatologist, to get a second ultrasound, just a detailed one to make sure everything's okay. And we thought, oh, that's fine. With our first daughter, this had happened to us, like she kept measuring too small. Mm-hmm. And so they sent us to like specialty ultrasounds like 4 times or something during the pregnancy. So we thought, whatever, sure. We actually had a weekend trip planned, go up the canyon in Utah, stay in the mountains. And so we scheduled it so that we would go to this doctor's appointment. We left our daughter with someone else, I can't remember who. We go to this doctor's appointment and go straight up the mountain, right? That's how kind of unconcerned we were. So we go to the appointment with the neonatologist, and it turned into like a 3-hour ordeal because there were serious issues. He found that like our daughter's brain was not developed properly, and that the amniotic fluid level was rising because the baby wasn't. So babies like process the amniotic fluid. I think they swallow it naturally, and it kind of goes through their body, and it kind of gets their digestion going. And that is an important part of kind of like the balance. I'm not an expert, but everything that goes on in the womb. And if that process shuts down, they said she's likely not swallowing, which is really dangerous. And so the fluid level was like rising, And he basically said, you need to be prepared that your daughter is going to have pretty significant disabilities. He said it's impossible to tell just from the ultrasound how significant, but it's going to be significant. And so we were just shocked, right? We 35 weeks, almost full term. And so it's actually a great blessing that we were able to like get in the car and just drive up into the mountains and have like this weekend to process it. And it was really interesting because I think my wife and I both just kind of felt this sense of like great peace about it. As we were going, I mentioned I was interested in like Orthodoxy and kind of ancient Christianity. I'd been reading the works of Julian of Norwich, you know who she is, like the English mystic. And just as we were driving up, she had this, her most famous phrase when she was contemplating sin, right? It just came right into my head, just like, all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. And I just thought, I don't know what's going to happen with this baby, but like God's got our back, So we went up there and we just talked about it. At that time we were just like, you just don't know what to expect. Like, is this going to be a child that is going to be disabled her whole life? We just didn't know. Like, kind of ironically, beautifully ironically, we had already picked her name. So I had twin sisters growing up that had died. Their names were Sarah and Emily. And one of them was stillborn and the other lived a few months. And so when we found out we were expecting our second daughter, we said, let's name her after them, Sarah Emily Hess. And so, it's kind of like, wow, like we even picked the name of this, my sister's who passed away, and now she's going to have problems. There's something's going on here that's kind of beyond us, right? Anyway, so we came back from the trip, and the doctor had told us that we should expect that my wife would go into labor soon, because when the amniotic fluid levels rise, the belly gets bigger and bigger, and that triggers labor. And true to his word, I think it was on Monday, but it was maybe on Tuesday, my wife went into labor. And because we knew that there were going to be complications, we went to a bigger hospital than we were planning on giving birth at. That was also a great blessing. If we hadn't known about this, if she'd just gone into labor, we would have gone to our local hospital. Because when our daughter was born, she wasn't able to breathe on her own. So they would have had to rush her to this other hospital, and then my wife would have been here and the baby there, and so we went down to this hospital in Provo, Utah, and she was born in 2000. This was 2014, and so when she was born, she couldn't breathe on her own. They kind of whisked her off to the NICU, and I stayed with my wife. She was born via C-section. That night I went up to the NICU to see our daughter, and her doctor was there, the newborn specialist. And talking to the doctor, she started using words like, we want to give you like as much time as you need with her. Do you know what I mean? Like, it became clear that this doctor expected that she would die, right? And that was the first intimation that we'd had that what she had would be life-threatening, right? And I remember thinking, like, we've got to get my wife up here. You know, like, she hasn't seen her baby yet. And if she dies, like, what if she dies tonight and my wife never holds her or something? So I went down to her room and I was just like, we have to get her upstairs. And they're like, well, she just had a C-section. And I was like, I don't care. Like, we have to get her up to see the baby. So we did. Like, we got her up there. My wife's a champion. Like, she recovers really well from things like that. So anyway,
Bless her.
we went up there, and over the next couple of days, they ran all sorts of tests, you know, like scanning the brain, testing reflexes and all these things. And her condition was just really bad, worse than even the original doctor had suspected. Like, she couldn't swallow on her own at all. You know, as you can imagine, if you can't swallow, like if you can't process your own mucus, like you can't really live, right? Like, your lungs are going to be constantly filling with fluid, right? When she was on the respirator, she was able to breathe. She wasn't fully dependent on the respirator to breathe, if that makes sense. They can, like, I don't know how they know, like the respirator's doing 80%, she's doing 20%. It was something like that, right? And after a couple of days, you know, we had like this meeting with the neonatologist where they just said, like, your daughter just won't be able to survive unless she's hooked to machines her entire life, you know? And so we had to just decide like what to do, you know? And so we spent some time praying about it, and we just felt like the right thing to do was to just let her pass away. You know, it's not much of a, we felt like it would be selfish for us to just keep her alive on machines, you know, with like extraordinary care and that sort of thing. So on her fourth day alive, you know, we gathered around, gave her a baby blessing, had like all family there, and then just disconnected her, and we just kind of held her in our arms as she passed away.
That must have been so brutal.
Yeah, it was hard. I mean, you know, you can imagine it, right?
Yeah.
And but like, the amazing thing was that both my wife and I felt like the presence of God so closely. It was probably like, I don't know how to describe it. It was like we were just wrapped in God's love. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And
was she in pain as she passed?
No. I mean, they don't think so. She was very calm. You know, it was just, she was a little
Bless her.
weak thing, you know.
Lord.
And it was very peaceful, you know. And just that whole experience was just like so beautiful, and which is a strange thing to say, right? Like, losing a child, losing a baby like that. But it was just a testament of, it just was a time of love. Like, we loved her, and honestly, we could sense her love for us, which, you know, I know how that sounds, but, you know, they told us that she was blind. But I swear she was following our faces, you know? And anyway, just everyone, just like the whole community came together. It was just family, community, just love. And God's love during that time just felt like something tangible. It was like it was like this moment where like I needed it and it was there, you know? It was like I could reach out and just grab it. And it was interesting because I was in this time where I kind of felt very divided in sense of like Mormonism or like Orthodoxy, you know, like this was it was becoming a live option for me. And there was a degree to which this kind of like strengthened my LDS faith, because, you know, that was the context in which it happened. And I was like, oh, this is so beautiful. But, you know, for my wife especially, like, it was very much like an affirming experience of her LDS faith. For me, it was an affirming experience of like God, right? Like, I was like, oh, God is so good. Like, he's there for us. But it wasn't like tied to Mormonism in my mind. Anyway, so I share that just because it was just such another one of these like pivotal spiritual moments in my life that kind of really defined the way that I relate with God and just how real it all felt. A few months after that was when my interest in Orthodoxy really kicked into high gear. I kind of like, once kind of that settled down, like we're probably like 4 or 5 months later, I think, it's hard to remember. This is 2014 or so. And I started really deciding to like delve deeper into it. I started making this really close study of the New Testament. I don't know if you have an Orthodox study Bible or not.
Do.
Yeah. But it's got this great commentary from church fathers. And it just really opened up my way of like seeing the New Testament with new eyes, right?
It probably showed you that there wasn't this great apostasy either.
Oh,
if you're learning.
certainly. That seemed like a huge theme to me, was like the faithfulness of the early church and like God's promises as the new Israel, and how like the church is like this permanent institution. Like that was all starting to sound like really plausible to me as I'm reading the scriptures. But I was still just like too afraid to take any steps toward anything. And then one night this is why I say I'm going to sound like such a charismatic.
Well, many of the saints sounded like that too. So
I'm not a saint.
I wouldn't apologize for it.
But I had a dream. So by this time, several of my other siblings had left the church, the LDS Church. But I had just found out that my youngest sibling, who had just turned 18, had left the church as well. And I was really worried about him. And so I had this dream where in my dream, my youngest brother and I were walking along this like row of churches. And when we got to the end of the row, there was a Catholic church on our left and an Orthodox church on the right. And so we kind of dipped into the Catholic church, and I'd never been to Mass, and I'd never been to Divine Liturgy, right? And so, in this dreamlike state, we kind of see the Mass. I don't remember what it looked like, but I remember we kind of walked out being like, well, that was nice, And then we walked into the Orthodox parish on the right, and it was so beautiful and overwhelming that it woke me up. I woke up, it was like 5 a.m. I like woke up and I thought, I have to go to an Orthodox Divine Liturgy today. It was a Saturday. I didn't know how that would happen in Utah. As you might imagine, there's not a lot of Orthodox churches. But I looked it up and found out there's an Orthodox mission like 15 minutes from my house, and they were having liturgy that day. They had only visiting priests would come out to serve that mission. But they were having one that day.
Not Vespers, Divine Liturgy.
Divine Liturgy, Saturday morning. Yeah.
Okay.
And so I was like, I'm going. Like, I have to go, right?
Did you tell your wife?
Yeah. Yeah. I said, I have to go to Divine Liturgy today. And I don't remember if I told her about the dream or not. And she's like, okay, whatever. Go if you have to. So I went, and it was just totally bizarre, right? Like, it was, there was like 2 other people there. A priest from Salt Lake City, had come down to serve Divine Liturgy, Father Justin, and like one cantor, and the music was weird, and the incense was weird, and the icons were weird. And I remember just kind of sitting there being like, this doesn't seem like my dream. But it was like my first exposure to it, right? Like the first real experience of liturgical worship. And I just remember driving home afterwards just thinking like, this is just a strange experience to me. Like just that dream and going, and what a different way to worship.
Yeah. Is there no liturgical aspects in the LDS Church?
None on the regular weekly.
Okay.
So they're kind of like, it's much more, Mormonism is kind of like high church theology, low church worship.
Okay.
So they're quite sacramental, right? Like with, all men being priests, and they give blessings, and what they call just the sacrament is like communion service it's seen as having like real effect. It's not just a memorial meal. I mean, it is a memorial meal to them, but like you are renewing your baptismal covenant, like your personal covenant when you partake of the sacrament. So it has like a real thing that's occurring when you do it. It's not just, we're just remembering Jesus.
I love what you're pointing out, though, because I think too often Catholics or Orthodox, I presume, are so enamored by their beautiful liturgy, which is in fact beautiful, that they just think, I'm going to bring my mate over here, and just the sheer beauty is going to blow him away. And sure, sometimes that happens, but if you're not accustomed to liturgical worship, it is, as you say, it's just kind of weird. Yeah,
on a regular Sunday, LDS worship is, you come in, you get kind of a pretty informal greeting by like the leader of the congregation. It's like, welcome to church. We're happy to have you here today. We're going to start by singing this song. And then the whole congregation sings a hymn. And then they'll do some announcements and things like that. Some like kind of business, take care of some business. And then you'll move into, they call it the sacrament portion, where they sing a song, they bless the bread and they use water, and then they pass the trays around, everyone takes it, and then you get a couple sermons and then it's over, and you sing a song and it's done. So very low church.
Yeah, I didn't realize that.
In the temple, it's very liturgical, or it's very ritualistic, right? It's not anything like a traditional Christian liturgy, but it's extreme. It's ritual beginning to end, which is very shocking to a lot of LDS people when they go to the temple the first time, because all your exposure is this very low church thing, and then you go into this, 2-hour-long ceremony that is just totally regimented, and and you're just like, what the heck, like, Do
you think the experience of many Mormons are, why don't we do this back there, or is it I don't like this at all?
If so, many of them have the second experience where they don't like it. I had a cousin that basically left the church for years because she was kind of traumatized by her first temple experience.
What's traumatizing about it?
Well, I don't know how much details I want to get into.
That you don't have to, but why don't you want to get into details?
Because I'd have to explain what would you found so strange.
Okay.
It's very similar to, there's a lot of Masonic elements in the LDS temple, because
wild.
I mean, there's a lot of things that are like exactly copied from Masonry.
Wow.
Including things like special hand grasps and special hand signs that you learn and that sort of thing. And so to go from,
hey, we're going to sing a song.
Yeah, we're going to sing a song and kind of talk about Jesus, kind of like many LDS services would feel very similar to like many Protestant services on a Sunday, just in terms of what's talked about,
just
et cetera.
Better looking people in better clothes.
That's right.
That's just my assumption. Yeah.
And then you go to the temple and it's like, we're going to teach you secret passcodes and things like that.
I can see how that
to get into heaven, and you're kind of like, what is this?
Can you please tell me, our listeners, about the temple card, the ID that I presume you have that, because that's just cool.
Yeah, so they have this thing called the temple recommend. So to go in the temple, you have to be a member in good standing, worthy to attend. It's only for people who are really living the faith. So that includes standards to get your temple recommend, you have to meet with two people, your bishop and then what's called your stake president, who's like the next guy above him. And they both ask you the set of same questions. And they start with just sort of like, do you believe in God, Jesus, and the Holy Ghost? Do you believe in Joseph Smith and the restoration of the gospel? Do you support and uphold the current leadership of the church? That sort of thing. Then they say, do you keep the law of chastity? Do you keep the word of wisdom? Like, do you not, which is mostly means, do you abstain from alcohol, coffee, tea, and tobacco? Do you pay a full tithing? Only full tithe paying members, like a full 10% of your income you have to pay that in order to get your recommend. So a series of questions like that. When you finish that, you get a little card that has your name on it, and you have to present that to them to get into the temple.
Now, this is not important at all, but is it laminated? Is your face on it? How does it look like a driving license?
No, you can just Google it and see. It's just a piece of paper. Now, when I first went through the temple, it's literally just a piece of paper with your name on it. They now do have a barcode system. So when you go there now, they scan it. So that way they can like deactivate recommends or whatever if they need to, that sort of thing.
Okay.
But it doesn't have your picture on it. At least I don't think it still does. I don't think that there's like a picture of you that comes up on the screen. Maybe there does.
Yeah.
It's a cool idea. I'm looking at the picture of it. It looks like a library card from the 90s.
Oh, really?
Yeah. That's about right. I would agree.
It looks like it's like maybe 4:3 ratio. It says the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Yeah. It's got first name, middle initial, last name. This picture is really low quality. Let me try to find one I can actually see.
I like the idea. I wish we could implement that.
No, so it's a business card.
Give one to Nancy Pelosi or take it away from her.
It's a business card that gets folded in half, and on the back it has your signature, the ward you're at, which would be like your parish, right?
Yeah.
And then your stake, which is like your diocese, and then the signature of the bishop and the signature of the stake president.
Yeah. And now,
there's a number on it, which you said now they have barcodes.
Now they have barcodes, and so they're like they have to be activated via kind of like the computer system before you can use it, that sort of thing. And so they're not that hard to there have been times when people have shared them, passed them around.
Yeah.
I mean, that's very discouraged, and culturally it's very frowned on. I'm not, but like, say there have been some people who've wanted to like kind of expose temple ceremonies, and they've snuck in with cameras and whatever. And so sometimes they'll get those, find disaffected members and take their recommends and do that sort of thing. I don't recommend that. I think that's very disrespectful of something that people hold very sacred. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, safeguarding the sacraments is very important. But gatekeeping the sacraments is not good. And where you draw the line between safeguarding and gatekeeping is obviously going to be like difficult to do. But I would hesitate to gatekeep the Eucharist in such a way, if that makes sense. I don't know. I mean, I like the way the Orthodox do it. Like when I was going to the Orthodox Church, the pastor, the priest knows all the people in his parish. Like if he doesn't know you, he's not going to give you the Eucharist. He'll be like, "Who are you?" If you wanted the Eucharist, you should have come to me before Divine Liturgy and told me who you are and where you're from, and when your last confession was. So
this first experience of the Divine Liturgy was a bit weird.
Yes. Sorry. Yeah. Get
us back to that.
So it was weird, but it kind of like grew on me a little bit. I was like, it's kind of like the attraction of the exotic almost, right? Like, wow, what the heck was that?
Now, do you think if you went to that exact same Divine Liturgy today, you'd find it rather beautiful?
Oh, yes, definitely. Okay. I mean, it was still very simple. It was still a very simple liturgy, right? In this small mission parish with like 3 people there, no deacon, so it was a very simple liturgy, but I would definitely find it beautiful now. Okay, so now we can jump forward to a lot of like breaking point. I know you keep wanting to get there. Sorry for all the background and stuff.
No, it's all been great.
So in 2017, I got a phone call on my phone while I was at work, and it said the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints on, and I was like, what the, actually it said it in German, I remember, for whatever, technology, but German's similar enough to English. I was like, the Church of Jesus, La Kirche, the Kirche, Die Kirche, de whatever. So I answer the phone and I was like, hello, this is Isaac. And a woman says, hi, is this Isaac Hess? And I say, yes. And she says, I'm the secretary of Elder Christofferson, and he's wondering if he could speak with you. Do you have a moment? So to explain who this was,
please. The
LDS Church is led by 15 men that they consider prophets, seers, and revelators. Okay, there's 3 that serve in like what they call the first presidency, so it's the president of the church and his 2 counselors. That's 3. And then there's the quorum of the 12 apostles. Okay, so and all 15 of them are referred, the church believes like they're prophets, seers, and revelators. That's like their official title. And so this was one of the apostles calling me on the phone. And I was like, what
is happening?
I mean, this is totally bizarre.
What would that be like? Give us a kind of Catholic context for this. Would that be like just some rando getting a call from Cardinal Pell or something like, not Cardinal Pell, but someone who's alive?
It would be. That'd
be really weird.
Yeah. It's hard to say exactly because of how revered these men are, Like the best I could say would be like, I would say all 15 of them in many ways are kind of like at the level of the Pope.
Yeah, it's 15. That's not many.
There's like 15. Imagine there were like the Pope and he had 14 other people that were Pope like him, kind of.
Yeah.
Yes, there may be one who's like the actual president of the church and he's the most revered.
A patriarch.
But all 15 of them are like so revered. So to get a phone call, I mean, I had like twice or 3 times in my life met some of them before, just like a moment, like shake their hand when they came to some big meeting I was at, right? And even that's considered a great honor to like shake the hand of an apostle.
I don't want to derail your story, but I was asked to give a big talk in Salt Lake City. I think it was in Salt Lake City in Utah. And it was this massive Mormon conference. There must have been 5,000 people there.
Yeah.
And the prophet couldn't do it, so they asked me.
Oh my goodness. Are you serious?
Yeah, and it wasn't a Mormon gathering. It was actually an anti-porn conference.
Yeah.
But
what year was this?
Oh, gee. Way before I started doing interviews about Mormonism. I'll tell you that. That must have been about 6 to 10 years ago, sometime in there. And I gave this big talk on pornography. But I was a little like, I'm so sorry, I'm not
the prophet.
People.
Yeah.
Well, not the prophet, sorry.
Oh, but someone one of the apostles.
Yes, I believe so.
Okay.
Yeah. If I'm wrong, I'm sorry, but I'm pretty sure that was how it went.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I said, sure. So I duck into a conference room at work, and she's like, I'm connecting you now. And then boom, the next thing I hear is like, hi, is this Isaac? This is Todd Christofferson. And I was just like, my mind was, and I was like, what is going on? I said, hi. And he said, do you remember writing a letter to me? And then I remembered. So about a year or two before, in one of these moments of like crisis in my faith, he had given like a talk in what we call general conference. We call them a talk. It's like a sermon. We call them talks in Mormonism. And it had like really spoken to me. And so I'd sent him a letter, kind of sort of being like, hey, I'm really struggling with my faith. I know you probably get letters from people all the time. And, you know, and I said, I don't really expect you to respond, but I just wanted you to know whatever, I'm struggling, etc. And and this was like 2 years before. So like he calls me 2 years later. He's like, I finally got to your letter or whatever. And he's just like, I just thought it was such a lovely thing. He's like, and I'm so sorry. I was wondering if you wanted to talk. I was like, I would love to. But at this time, I kind of was in a good spot with my faith, you know, and because, you know, I mentioned I was kind of up and down. So it was during one of my up periods. And so I said, you know, I don't really feel like the same urgency that I had. He's like, well, the least I could do is have lunch with you. Why don't you come up to Salt Lake and have lunch with me? And I thought, absolutely. You know, like how often, you know, this is such a privilege. Like I remember, here's some context. I remember telling a relative of mine about this. And he said something like, I would walk all day and all night if I had to in order to have lunch with one of these men, you know? And I was like, well, I had, you know, I got invited. I took the car.
In Mormon culture, in Salt Lake City, are these fellas recognizable?
Oh, yeah. Oh, totally. Yeah. People will walk up to them. If they're like out in public, like people will walk up to them and like shake their hand, you know? I mean, anywhere they go, I mean, there's enough Latter-day Saints that like these people, if they're just in the airport, people will walk up to them, you know? You address them as elder. And so you're just like, oh, Elder Christofferson, like, I just want to meet you, you know, I'm a Latter-day Saint, whatever, right? They're very, very revered.
So you went out to lunch somewhere publicly or?
No, I went to, they have the place where the highest church leaders work is called the Church Administration Building. It's this beautiful old early 20th century, I think is when it was built. Maybe 19th century building, you know, marble columns, beautiful floors, ornate, just, you know, and they have like a little cafeteria in there. And so he just had me, that's where he works. So I just showed up to lunch and he invited me in and we got some food and we sat down at a table. You know, there were like 3 other apostles sitting at other tables and like deep conversation. I met the man who's now the president of the church. He was there. His name's President Nelson. And so like he's the current prophet. I met him during that visit. And we just had like a lovely chat for like an hour or two where I kind of told him my story. I told him about how you know, at this point, 3 of my brothers had left the church. But I was still kind of hanging on, right? I even told him about my interest in Orthodoxy and kind of the reasons at that time that I was still LDS. And so it's just a nice conversation. Like he didn't share, I almost wished that I had gone at a time when I was in more turmoil, because then I would have gotten more kind of like spiritual advice from him. But it was more just like a kind of get to know you, talk to him for a while. But it was just this crazy experience. And it actually, weirdly enough, kind of ended up precipitating my finally leaving the church. And here's how it happened.
Well, before that, how did he respond to you saying you were looking into Orthodoxy? Fine. He was like, you know, there's so much beauty in these other faiths, you know, and he totally understood why, like, I would have some attraction to that. So, yeah, I mean, it wasn't like a negative thing. Okay. We just kind of swapped some stories and, you know, kind of got to know him on a personal level. He was such a kind and good person. You know, sometimes within like the ex-Mormon community, people will like be like, oh, these men are evil. And like, they don't actually believe, they're just like putting one on. And all I can say is like, when I met him and met others, and I had multiple interactions with him after this too, that like, he just seemed such a sincere, kind, you know, you talked about how great Latter-day Saints are. Like he seemed to embody all of the best things in that culture. And so I had that lunch and, you know, every now and then I would exchange a letter with him or something like that. And then that fall, he gave me another call and asked if he could share my story in his next general conference address that was coming to happen in October.
And I was like kind of blown away by this, you know, because twice a year, like I said, they have this huge meeting. It lasts for a whole weekend. They do like meetings on Saturday and on Sunday. It's broadcast to the entire world. They call it General Conference. And every member of the church leadership gives us a sermon to just about whatever they think church members should know or should hear. And Latter-day Saints take this really seriously because these men are prophets, seers, and revelators. So whatever they speak on is like, for the next like 6 months in Sunday school, that's what they study, is what they said at the last conference. And so I was like, wow. And they frequently will share, you know, stories of individuals, faith promoting stories, that sort of thing. So I was really honored to be someone whose story he shared, right? And so my wife and I went up to the conference. We got to like sit in like these special guest seats near the front, and it was just a cool experience. You know, I had more pictures with him and with some other apostles, and it just was kind of this surreal thing. So he did that, and when it was over, I shared it with my family, right? Especially with like my siblings who had left. I was like, hey, you know, because it actually talked about them a little bit. Talked about how, you know, he's sort of like he didn't use my name in this story, but he's like a young man, had several siblings who left the church, and, you know, they tried to get him to go too, but he stayed strong, you know, just kind of like that sort of thing. So I shared that with some of my brothers, and my oldest brother kind of emailed me back and said, you know, he's like, you know, I would just love to be able to just talk to you about this. Like, he's like, we've never talked really about my faith transition and about Mormonism, and, you know, he's like, I'll admit it's kind of weird to be the bad guy in a general conference talk. And he's like, I would just love to talk. And I just thought, yeah, let's talk. Like, he and I we were so close growing up. And when he left the LDS faith, it really kind of put a rift in our relationship. And I thought, yeah, I want to try to connect with him. Like, let's do it. So we picked a night, and I drove up to Salt Lake just so we could just kind of chat friendly about the church. And it was a really good conversation. Like, he wasn't mean. He wasn't like disrespectful, but he like challenged me, right? About the faith and the things that I had kind of tried to put to bed over the years. And he was just like,
you had shared those with him then?
No, but you know, he knew what they were. I don't know. There's a certain kind of set of issues that but it was more, the conversation was not so much about those things, but a more sort of like, wouldn't you think that God would want you to like use your mind to investigate, to like understand these things, and to like really know the truth, right? Like, instead of kind of like shutting it off and just being like, no, I can't think about these things. I can't learn about these things. I can't read about these things. He's like, truth is truth. And we should be willing to face even hard truths. And I just remember my heart just being like, yes, right? Like, yes, we should. Like, I don't want to believe in something that I'm afraid to examine. I don't want to believe in something that can't stand up to the just basic questions of being reasonable. Does that make sense?
Complete sense.
You know? And I'm not saying at that time I was like, I'm sure that this doesn't stand up, but I had been unwilling to do that kind of inquiry, right? Because it felt unfaithful to me. Like, I was like, well, I have this testimony, right? I have this witness of the Holy Spirit.
I will say this. I think a lot of people want to talk the talk about, ask the questions. If it's not true, I don't want to believe it.
Yeah.
I would say the majority of us who are intellectually engaged speak that way.
Yes.
But I think most of us haven't been willing to take that and then turn that magnifying glass on the thing we hold most dear.
I remember him asking, and this is a question that lots of kind of like ex-Mormons ask people who are still believing members, something like, if the church wasn't true, would you want to know it?
It's a great question.
You know, like, if it wasn't, would you want to know it or not?
Don't say yes too quickly, right?
And I didn't. I thought for a moment, but then I thought, yes, like I would want to know it because I want truth, you know, I want the truth. And so I kind of left that conversation like really, not so much shaken, but just sort of like, this was really spinning in my head. You know, it was only like a month after I'd had this whole experience where I was like used in general conference. Mm-hmm. And I just kept thinking and thinking about this, you know, and, you know, I was still very much believed in God. And so I was also kind of thinking to myself, like, what does God want me to do? Does God want me to like perform this kind of inquiry? And I kept thinking about verses in scripture about sort of like, Paul talks about the importance of like testing the spirits, right? And in the first epistle of John, he says like, do not trust every spirit, but test the spirits to see which are from God, right? Like there's this whole theme in the New Testament, not of like discounting religious experience or spiritual experience, but also of testing the experience. And I just became like totally convinced that I had to go on this kind of like this journey. Like, I had been up and down in my faith so many times. And so this conversation kind of put me down again. And I just thought, no more, right? Like I am going to face this head on. I'm not going to avoid it anymore. I am going to grapple with this. And I'm going to come out on the other end like a stronger Latter-day Saint or not a Latter-day Saint. Like those are my options.
Yeah.
And I'm not doing anything else. And I also am going to stop, having this dalliance with Orthodoxy. I'm going to like dig into that too, because maybe I'll become Orthodox, maybe not. But like, I don't want to keep making it this hobby. I want to know. So in like November of that year, after Thanksgiving, I sat down with my wife and like had that conversation. And I was just like, I have to do this. Like, I have to like really know what I believe. And I have to know about Mormonism, and I have to decide what I believe about Orthodoxy. And as part of that, it's like, I'm going to stop coming to church every Sunday because I want to go to divine. I'd never been to a Sunday divine liturgy. And it's like, how can I investigate it if I never even go? Right. And the time's conflicted and whatnot. And that was like a very hard conversation to have, as you might imagine. But she was like, okay. I mean, what else could she say? Right. Like, so that was kind of when it came to a head.
This is difficult, right, in marriage situations, because usually the one person who begins to have doubts and to study is doing that maybe privately because they don't want to just upend their marriage and their family if there's no need to do it. I'm thinking of Scott and Kimberly Hahn, right? Like Scott does this deep dive into Catholicism and the inconsistencies and things like sola scriptura and other things. So that when he finally has this conversation with Kimberly, even though Kimberly's a very bright woman, and let's just not use them as an example, but it's not that the wife isn't as smart or smarter. It's just that you can't actually win an argument with someone who hasn't stopped thinking about this thing from every angle for the last several years. It's not a conversation you can win.
Yeah.
Even if you're wrong, it's like if I try to get into a conversation with my dad about why 9/11 was an inside job, God bless him, I can't win that conversation. If you doubted the moon landing, I wouldn't be able to win because they've done so much more research thinking about this.
Yeah. Yeah. And I honestly
it's a tough place
remember
for a wife to be in.
I don't remember if it devolved into an argument or not, like about, like you shouldn't do this or whatever. I remember she was obviously really concerned about like, what's this going to do to our family life? What's this going to do to your faith? She had seen my siblings leave the church, and now I seem to be kind of going on the same journey. So she had kind of justifiable fears. Like, I think she, in her mind, she thought, I know where this is going to end, right? Like, you're probably going to leave. At the time I was still open to the idea of staying LDS, but not in a way where I was like afraid. I was like, I have to like know the issues and could only stay LDS if I found like good resolutions to them, So this started like this very intense period of my life of just study. One of the first things I did was I bought a copy of the Apostolic Fathers and just started reading, because Mormonism is premised on this idea of a great apostasy, that after Jesus died, his apostles went out and established, basically the LDS Church. It doesn't have to look exactly like it, but, in its essentials, that's what the LDS Church is supposed to be, is like the restoration of the original church. But then sometime after the apostles died, and probably really soon after, the church went into apostasy. So I was really interested in reading the witness of these early Christians, to like hear how they talked. Like that was almost as important to me as what they said. Like, how are they speaking? Are they kind of talking about like, oh man, things are going off the rails now that the apostles are gone, right? Or are they speaking in different ways? And I was just blown away, right? Reading Ignatius of Antioch, reading the Didache, reading the First Epistle of Clement, and all these very early Christian writings. First of all, I was shocked at how much there was. I mean, I know there's not a ton in one sense, but the fact that you can fill like a fat volume with the writings of the first generations of post-apostolic Christians is pretty impressive, given how long ago that was. So like little things like the Didache explicitly makes an allowance for non-immersive baptism, right? It's like, and that was a huge deal in Mormonism. Like that was like one of the big signs of the apostasy. It's like, oh, they changed baptism. And the Didache was probably written during the apostolic age, like toward the end of it. And here, no, I mean, maybe you could make the argument like, oh, well, the apostasy just started even earlier, right? But at some point, you're just kind of like, what's the most reasonable explanation for this? Probably the apostolic deposit included
and wouldn't you expect to see seeds, at least, of LDS theology
yes.
in the writings of the post-apostolic fathers as the apostasy was? It's not like in one day everybody
yes.
forgets the true faith
yes.
and starts teaching something different. You would
yes.
expect to see elements of LDS theology in there.
And there are some Latter-day Saint apologists who have tried to do this. It usually amounts to like very out of context proof texting, where it's like, look, this person kind of said this line that in this specific translation and without context kind of sounds like one of our teachings, right? But my experience was that I tried to be as diligent as I could. I chased all those quotes down, right? And every time after time after time, I was like, oh, that's not what they're saying at all. Like they're not talking about, ex LDS doctrine. They're talking about something completely different. This is just out of context. And then if you consult the body of this person's work, like say Origen's work, it becomes totally clear that like he does not believe this thing that the LDS apologists were claiming is there. I was very affected by the Eucharistic discussions that you find in Ignatius of Antioch and Justin Martyr about it being the body and blood of Christ, about the importance of the bishop and the episcopacy. Like you see these early witnesses to apostolic succession in Ignatius and in First Clement. Like First Clement is like, has that one section where he's very clear and says something like, with the apostles had perfect foreknowledge that there would be disputations about the office of the bishop, and so, given that foreknowledge, they appointed men and said that when these fall asleep, others should be appointed in their place. So like, instead of seeing people being like, oh man, we're without leadership, the apostles are gone and we can't make new ones. Because in Mormonism, the apostolic college is like this ongoing body, right? One of them dies, you put in another one. There's always 12. Instead of that, I saw, apostolic succession, like this church being like, we've got the tools, we have what God gave us, we have successors to the apostles, the bishops, and so just the way they spoke, it just didn't strike me as LDS, right? It struck me as kind of like what you might call like proto-Catholicism or proto-Orthodoxy, this thing that becomes what later was. And then, so I was like deep diving into like early Christianity, and simultaneously I'm deep diving into LDS history. I reread Rough Stone Rolling cover to cover. I am just like looking up works of other historians. Like I'm doing like deep dives into the Book of Mormon, and like whether it's historical or not, like what's the evidence for and against this being like an actual ancient record, and similar to like another work that Joseph Smith produced called the Book of Abraham. And if you want to get into either of those things, I'd be happy to and talk like details. I'll leave that up to you. But I just became away just totally convinced that those things were not historical, that they were products of the 19th century.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, and that's when I was saying earlier that during this time, I tried really hard to not focus on, was Joseph Smith a bad person? Or do I not like him? Or did he say or do some things that I don't like? I tried really hard to keep it laser focused on like the core issues, the foundational issues of the faith. Like if this falls, the faith falls. In a similar way that like you would focus really laser on like the resurrection or something for Christianity. It would be like if someone comes along and says, there's really good evidence that Jesus didn't even exist, right? And if you were like, well, you're just mad because the Pope's a bad person or whatever, right? Or, and they're like, no, I think Jesus didn't exist. And it's like, if you look into that and you're like, whoa, I think he didn't exist. Well, you probably shouldn't be a Christian, right? In a similar way, when I became just convinced that the Book of Mormon was a 19th century work,
without getting into the weeds, only because many people who are watching may not be Mormon, obviously we have Mormon viewers as well, help us understand what you think may be the best arguments against these Mormon works that show that they are 19th century inventions.
Yeah. So in general, and some of this was like the way I was trained. So like I studied literature in college, and I'm not an expert in this, and I don't claim to be. So I'm not being like, well, I studied this in college, so therefore. But it did give me a way of thinking about texts, like reading them closely and kind of looking for things. And there's, if you wanted to date a book, you find a work and you don't know when it's from, right? Like, what tools do you use? There's all sorts of tools that you have. And this is an analogy that I've given before. If someone came and was like, here is a book of ancient Egyptian recipes, and you thought, okay, cool, ancient Egyptian recipes. I like food. I'd love to cook some of these recipes. And you're flipping through the book and like, they all seem like good recipes and they all make sense given their context. And then you get like 2/3 of the way through and you find a recipe where one of the ingredients is a potato. Okay. You would instantly know that at least that recipe was not ancient, because the potato is a New World food. It was in the Americas, and they had no potatoes in ancient Egypt at all. So, and if the book had always been presented as like a single volume, like throughout its provenance, through its history, that's basically conclusive evidence that the whole book's a forgery, right? Even if all the rest of the recipes are good, tasty, maybe even plausibly ancient, like you can date when that book was written. So, and that's, probably most people know that's called an anachronism, is something that's like not in its time, like anachronos, right? Not in the right time. So the Book of Mormon is filled with anachronisms. Some of them are very straightforward, like it talks about animals existing in the Americas that all the best evidence show were not here.
Like horses.
Like horses, like elephants, flocks and herds. There were very few domesticated animals that the Native Americans domesticated. It's like pretty much like the llama and the alpaca, and there's just not really a way that those animals could stand in for what the Book of Mormon text demands of them. The book is also filled with 19th century Protestant theology. And this was noticed at the time, right? Like people who read the book at the time were like, oh, this is very convenient that you've basically addressed every hot button theological issue of right now, and it's claimed it's an ancient work, and I know like there are LDS apologists who know all of these objections and have answers to them. And like, if anyone's interested, I like totally encourage you, like, the best, the thing closest to Catholic answers on the LDS side is called Fair Latter-day Saints. They changed the name recently. FAIR, Fair Latter-day Saints. And you can go there and read their apologetics. And I think people should, like, don't just take one side of an issue. Look at both sides. That's important. But their responses always just seemed like so inadequate to me, just sort of like trying to wave things away. They would say for like the Protestant theology, like the Book of Mormon says that it's a book written for our day, right? And so we would expect these things to be in there. But like just the way they talk, all these like long sermons using very common Protestant phraseology, like you can find tons of other sermons from that time period that are using the exact same language.
And again, at what time period in history are these events said to have taken place?
So most of the Book of Mormon starts at 600 BC and goes to about 400 years after Christ. So about that 1,000-year period. Then there's a small section of the book that's supposed to take place even further back from that. But yeah, most of it is during that time. And so it's just really weird to think that there are these ancient Native American Christians running around having Protestant theological debates in like the year 200 BC, right? Like that's just, it's much simpler to just say, this is a book from the 19th century that is in dialogue with the theological questions of its day, of the year that it was published. or like the preceding years. And then for me, the biggest issue though, the biggest anachronism is like the plot of the book itself. So this requires like a little background. The early Americans saw all these, saw evidence of Native American civilization that did not match the Native Americans they saw around them. Okay. Then when by the time settlers arrived, when scientists now think that a huge proportion of Native Americans died from disease after initial contact with the Europeans, maybe as high as like 90% died in like a 100 to 200 year period. And so so when people showed up, like this idea we have of like Native Americans like being like very woodland and like rural and stuff, that impression came because there was such a die-off that many of their societies collapsed. And they're suddenly, so the land had been full of towns and
Really?
And villages. Like they had very sophisticated societies. I highly recommend a book. It's called 1491. And it like looks at like what Native Americans were like just before Columbus arrived. Like what's the best evidence? And they were very sophisticated groups, but boy, they couldn't fight smallpox, you know? And so when the early Americans saw these like these large mounds and these evidence of like greater society, and then they look at these Native Americans who were like very primitive, they were thought, well, they didn't do this. Someone else did this. There must have been, so it was very common in Joseph Smith's day. This is a very common belief that the Native Americans that we see now were not the ones who built these mounds and these cities and these earthenworks. There was another civilization that was very advanced and was probably white. There were lots of people because they were very racist, right? They like, couldn't be dark skinned. They got to be white like us. And many people were like, they were probably Israelites. They were probably Hebrews. So this was like a common, so you can find multiple books from this time period that kind of purport to be like, this is the history of the Native Americans. Some Hebrews came over, or some Israelites came over to America, and they established society and civilization. But then a savage group came, and there were many wars between them, and the savage group ended up killing off the civilized white people, you know, and that's who we see today. This was just like a trope. It was a common belief. And that is exactly how the Book of Mormon presents the history of the Native Americans. So it like fits perfectly in its time period. But it does that make sense? Kind of what I'm saying? Like that's the whole overarching plot of the entire book. There's these Israelites that come over and they end up splitting into two groups. And one of the groups gets cursed with dark skin. And there's like a light-skinned group and a dark-skinned group. And over a 1,000-year period, they like, it kind of follows their adventures, right? And their civilization. They have wars and they fight each other. And sometimes one group is good and the other is evil, and it switches back and forth, right? There's times where they merge into one group, but eventually it ends the same way that kind of everyone at the time kind of believed, which was that the savage group destroyed the civilized group. And that's who's the Native Americans today. So it was plausible to them because it kind of matched their preconceived notions.
When it was published.
Right? But it feels very strange to me to sort of claim like, no, that's actually the true story, right? And because of this, you know, LDS apologists now, so at the time it came out, it was pretty much everyone believed that this was telling a history of all the Native Americans. Now, because we can't find any like archaeological evidence to support these Book of Mormon societies, and you know, when you look at the geography of North and South America, it's just not plausible that like one civilization spanned the whole thing. Most LDS apologists now will say, well, this really took place in like a very small area with like a relatively small group of people, and that's why we haven't found them, and that's why it's plausible. But if you just look at it in the context of its time, it just totally looks like a product of, like, if someone were just to write a narrative, a sort of like romantic narrative of the origin of the Native Americans and published it in 1830, which was when the book was published, it just is what you would expect, right? It would tell this kind of origin story, just like today you would expect it to tell them walking across the Bering Strait, right? During some previous age. So to me, that was one of the things that I just thought, there's just no way that this is plausible, you know?
What about the use of steel and other metals?
Yeah. I mean, you know, like I said, lots of anachronisms. So it mentions a lot of metalwork in the Book of Mormon. And there were a few Native American groups that had very primitive metallurgy, but you know, there's a reason why what we find is obsidian arrowheads, right? All over, because it never became like a dominant. If you really did have a civilization that mastered metal in the way that these people say that they did, they would have totally taken over, right? They would have been a huge society, because if you master metal before your enemies, like, you know, you can't beat an army with metal arrow tips and metal swords with stone weapons and clubs. Like, you just can't do it. The metal's too powerful. So yeah, similarly, like they mentioned chariots and things like that. And there's no evidence that the Native Americans ever used wheeled, because they didn't have beasts of burden to pull them. And so they had, the closer you find Native American toys, ancient toys that have wheels on them that can like wheel around. But there was no evidence they ever had carts, that they ever had chariots or anything like that.
Wow. And as you're going through this and becoming convinced that this is just not what it was claimed to be, did you try to present it to other Mormons and be like, look, I'm not trying to attack your faith, but I tried to talk
to my wife about it, right? And it just didn't go well. Like it was, it just wasn't, she didn't want to know, you know what I mean? I mean, that makes it sound like too bad. But that was not, it was a painful topic for her. Yeah. That was hard for her to discuss. You know, as you can imagine, like she wasn't super jazzed about being like, hey, I'm losing my faith. Can I tell you all the reasons?
You want to come with me?
Yeah, right. You want me to tell you why? Yeah. You know? And it was painful for me, and it was painful for her. And so we talked about it some, and they were not always productive conversations.
Yeah. But so, yeah, fair enough.
Yeah.
Did you chat with your brother about this as you were finding these things out?
Not really. I mean, I had another friend of mine who was kind of going through a similar transition at the same time, one of my old friends. And so he and I would talk about it. Just kind of like things we were learning and that sort of thing. Yeah.
Wow.
But he was probably like the person I would vent to and kind of share my thoughts.
Was there a point in which you were like, I can't be Mormon any longer? Or was it just the accumulation of all of these things that just kind of pushed you out?
Yeah, it was kind of slowly pushing me out. So at the same time, I'm starting to go to Orthodox Divine Liturgy all the time. And I quickly, my first experience, as I said, I was like, oh, it's very strange. But I quickly fell in love with the liturgy. I just thought, I very quickly was like, this is so beautiful, this expression of Christian faith. And so for like more than a year, I attended very faithfully this Orthodox parish in Salt Lake City. I met with their priests, once a week, and would like just talk through issues. They were very, very available to me. I helped build one of their churches.
How so?
Well, they were building a church, and they would be like, hey, like come down and we're going to put like siding on today and put this wall up. And I would go and show up and help them out, And it was a beautiful parish, like this growing parish in Salt Lake, lots of converts, lots of people coming into the faith,
And yet during that, you said it was about a 5-year period that you were investigating Orthodoxy? Or?
Yeah. Well, the kind of acute period was like a little more than a year. Like after I said, I'm going to stop going to LDS Church.
Okay, so during that year, did you decide you would get baptized in the Orthodox faith? Or no, and why not?
So I never even officially became a catechumen. There was just always something that was holding me back, I always had, as much as I loved Orthodoxy, there were questions about it that I still really struggled with. And it's hard to articulate them like now. So there were a couple of things. One was, so this is what I had become convinced of through my reading of early Christian sources and the New Testament. Like, I don't want to de-emphasize the fact that I was like trying to read scripture really faithfully. I was totally convinced of the Eucharist and the real presence. I became very convinced of apostolic succession and like the need to be in communion with an apostolic bishop. But I was really troubled by the question of like, who should my bishop be, right? Like, who should be my pastor? Who's the shepherd of my soul on the earth? this was right around the time of the Ukraine or the schism that happened between Russia and Constantinople. And so that was really troubling to me too. And the parish I was attending was an Antiochian parish. And so they were in communion with both of them. So in one sense, it's kind of like, crisis averted, right? Like, if you join us, we get the best of all worlds. You can be in communion with all. But, there were also the Oriental Orthodox churches that I was aware of, and kind of thought, there's more than one group with apostolic succession, with the Eucharist.
Not to mention the Coptics.
Well, that's what I meant by Oriental Orthodox.
Oh, okay.
The Coptic, they're like the Coptics and the Armenians and that sort of thing. And I thought, how do I know which one I should be a part of? Like, who should be my bishop? And so that kind of became like this really important question. There are other things I struggled with Orthodoxy too, like because it's so decentralized, there were certain times when I would try to understand what the Orthodox teaching was just on some topic. Like, what do the Orthodox teach about X, right? And I would get different answers from different people. And sometimes they were very confident, right? They would even say things like, if you disagree, you're not Orthodox. And I'd be like, well, how do you know? And they'd kind of cite some church father or some monk that they liked or some aspect of the liturgy. But then the people on the other side would do the same thing. And, and there's a lot of unanimity in a lot of the beliefs, but there were enough.
There didn't seem to be a mechanism that could settle the score.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
This is something I've heard Michael often say in the past. He's like, with Catholicism, you can say, well, the church isn't doing what it should be doing.
Yeah.
But you can't say she doesn't possess the mechanism necessary to bring that into effect.
Yeah. And then there are also the questions of sort of like, so they held that pan-Orthodox synod, or they tried to, now I can't remember the year.
I don't remember, no.
But you know the one I'm talking about.
Not really, no.
Oh, so there's a lot of problems in modern Orthodoxy. A lot of them have to do with jurisdictional problems, right? The Orthodox agree that there should only be one bishop in one city. But in the New World, when they settled the New World, right, all these immigrants came from their different countries and they all sent their own priests and eventually they all sent their own bishops. So in Salt Lake City, there was an Antiochian parish.
What is it, Thursday?
Pan-Orthodox Synod took place in 2016.
And this was like right during my time, or shortly before.
Yeah.
I was going through this. So like in Salt Lake City, there's an Antiochian parish, a Greek parish, a Serbian parish, a Russian parish, and all of those had different bishops. Not that none of them, I don't think any of them had a bishop in Salt Lake, but they all had different bishops in different places, right? And the Orthodox recognize that this is not canonical. Like this is counter to their own canons about how the church should operate. There's supposed to be one bishop for one city, one church for a region. But, through historical circumstances, you have the situation that you have. So they started planning an Orthodox synod for 2016, and it was in the works for like decades, right? Decades and decades and decades, where they were like, let's plan this. We'll try to get all the Orthodox churches to come, and we'll be able to settle some of these disputes so that we can have like canonical administration in these different areas, and we can standardize like how we receive converts, because that was also like some Orthodox jurisdictions rebaptize everyone who shows up. Some of them accept baptisms from other denominations and whatnot. So there was like a whole list of things on the agenda, and it just totally fell apart. Like right before the meeting, the Russians were like, we're not coming, and the Russian Orthodox Church is by far the biggest in terms of its membership. It's like twice the size of anyone else. And then a couple other churches that are aligned with the Russians are like, well, we're not coming either if the Russians aren't coming.
This Wikipedia article is the best I've ever seen. The Russians pulled out because their belief that it was not truly pan-Orthodox without the Antiochian church.
Oh, is the Antiochians that pulled out first?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And the Antiochians pulled out over a dispute of the jurisdiction of Qatar that was also claimed by the Patriarchate of Jerusalem.
So so they did hold it. A couple churches went, like the Greek church was the biggest representative, like the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople. He, or at least his representatives, were there, and they held a big thing, and they came to some conclusions. They're like, we're going to do these things now, but like it didn't get accepted by any of the other. They're like, no, that's not like an They wanted it to be almost like an ecumenical council, right? We're going to reaffirm some doctrine. We're going to solve a bunch of jurisdictional disputes and a few other issues that we have that just in the world of Orthodoxy. And I kind of looked at that and I remember just thinking to myself, it would be really nice if there was just like someone who could like be like the locus of unity for this thing. You know, it's like a very natural thought to have. Like, that would be nice. That doesn't mean it's true, but it would be nice. There are some other things like in all the time I was exploring it, even though I really loved it, it always still felt foreign to me. Like I felt like a foreigner kind of appropriating something that wasn't mine. And that's not like a total disqualifying thing, but it was something that kind of gave me a little pause about, I just couldn't jump in with 2 feet, and I wanted to, but I found myself kind of unable to do it.
The rejoinder would probably be if you're joining an apostolic faith that dates back to the first centuries of the church, it should feel different. It should feel...
Well, it didn't feel... It's not that it felt... I wasn't bothered by the fact that it felt different. I liked the fact that it felt different, but it felt foreign. I don't know how else to describe it. Like, you know, I mean, it's a sort of a natural thing. Like if you're brought up kind of as a man of the West and then are introduced to sort of like the liturgy of the East, it has a foreign feel to it. Yeah. And sometimes that is very attractive to people. As an example, like just to skip ahead a little bit, like I definitely recognized the sort of affinity for the Western Rite when I encountered it, right? I was kind of like, this doesn't feel foreign. Like this feels like my people, like my patrimony, my heritage. So after like a full year of investigating Orthodoxy, more than a year, I kind of was just in a rut. I was like, I'm stuck and I don't feel any closer to becoming Orthodox. And I don't want to just be stuck for the rest of my life. I don't want to be a wanderer. I want to settle somewhere, you know?
Yeah.
And so that was the first time where I thought, maybe I should look into Catholicism. Like I've never looked into it. The only things I really knew about Catholicism were what I'd learned from Orthodox sources, because they discuss Catholicism a lot in their works. You know, sort of like Catholics this, not that, we're not that, we're this instead. Kind of like presenting Orthodoxy in contradiction to Catholicism. Some of which is fair and reasonable, and
I've seen that a lot too.
Some of which, when you study Catholicism, you're like, that's a misrepresentation, or that's a mountain out of a molehill kind of thing, right? So when I finally got to the point where I was willing to look at Catholicism, this was in early 2020, and I bought a catechism, and I remember just opening to the first page and immediately just being like, oh,
it's
yes,
so beautiful.
Like this is what I've been looking for. Just like I understand. I had just felt, and this is the very Western part of my mind. I know that lots of Orthodox people will listen to this and they'll say, you know, the liturgy, you should have just like given time for the liturgy to form you. Like it forms you, it helps you understand the faith. We don't need this like clear exposition of everything. There's something wrong with that even. Maybe they are like suspicious of it. And I totally get that. And I'm not even saying that's like a bad criticism. But for me, it's just, it's not what I needed. You know, I needed something a little more. I had questions and I couldn't get good answers. You know, I got a lot of people confidently telling me the Orthodox position, but they were contradicting each other sometimes, right? Whereas in the Catholic Church, like the Catechism just was this totally beautiful exposition of the faith. I read it cover to cover, and I was just like, this church is amazing. This wasn't what I was expecting at all, right? And so I determined I would go to Mass, and I just picked the closest parish to my house, and I went there, and it was terrible. It was like, I came home afterwards and my wife was like, so how was it? You know, what'd you think? And I said, it was like James Taylor singing the Mass.
Oh,
you know,
I'm
just
so
like,
sorry.
and I just remember sitting there, you know, like kneeling.
I feel like I'm apologizing on behalf of my family. Like I invited you to a family reunion and everyone was crazy.
Oh, I mean, I had been going to Orthodox liturgies for like a couple years. And the church I went to was beautiful. Beautiful church, you know, incense is like so thick you can barely breathe. Yeah. Icons everywhere. Beautiful chanting, beautiful 4-part Russian music.
Come on.
You know, and then...
let us build the city of God.
Yeah, I don't know what they sang, but it was just... I
experienced that a couple of weeks ago.
And like even just little things like the tabernacle was off to the side. And I remember being really bothered by that. I didn't know anything about the tabernacle controversies or whatever.
Sure.
But I just remember thinking like, you know, they're not acting the way that I know they're supposed to believe. I didn't know how they were supposed to act, I just thought, I know the doctrine of the Catholic Church. Like, I've read the whole catechism at this point, and I know the traditional doctrine of the Eucharist, and I know they affirm it, but it just didn't seem like the liturgy communicated that. And I was very disappointed, right? I came home and it kind of just like cooled my jets completely. I was just like, maybe this isn't for me. And I just felt homeless again, you know? And
this is so important that you're sharing this story because it's a very common experience.
Yeah. I know.
There are people watching, they want to convert and they'll go up to the local parish and they're like, what is this? What is happening?
Yeah. Well, and you know, to be clear, as we said before, that can happen with a very beautiful liturgy too, right? I have known people who have come to even Catholic liturgies with me and sort of been like, that was weird. You know, beautiful Catholic liturgies.
Yes.
And just be like, I didn't like that at all. So, you know, your aesthetic experience is not everything. And you have to be properly prepared to absorb beauty, even when it's objectively there, I think. Like, if your heart's not really ready to receive it, or if you're just not in a mode to actually receive it, you can't receive it. So it wasn't just that. It was just that it just didn't seem like the way they acted just didn't seem to reflect the doctrine. That was really the issue. I think that you can. In fact, I have been to liturgies where they've had guitars playing, but like the Eucharist was treated. In fact, I'll give you an example. A parish in Cedar City, Utah. Father, I apologize in advance. The music at the parish is not good. Not for me. I don't like it. But the priest there, who's a wonderful man of Polish descent, he celebrates the Eucharist with such a reverence that even though the music is as, you know, whatever you want to fill in the blank, as Novus Ordo music as you could possibly imagine, he communicates in every step of that liturgy that the Eucharist is the body of Christ and the blood of Christ. Totally, and I love going there when I visit friends there. Even though, you know, music, not my cup of tea. So it can be, but at this parish, it was just so casual. It was so casual. So anyway, I was just kind of like, nah, probably not for me.
Did you have the sense that whatever the Catholic Church was, maybe it isn't anymore?
Yeah. And I was kind of annoyed by that, you know? It's kind of like, you guys lost something, you know?
Yeah.
But then I went on a business trip to Atlanta. I don't know, a month later, maybe, something like that.
This is before COVID lockdowns?
It's just before COVID. So this is still in January. I think this is like late January. I'm in Atlanta on a business trip, and I find out that my hotel is like within walking distance of this beautiful Catholic church. It's called, I think it's Christ the King Cathedral in Atlanta. Have you been there before?
I used to live in Atlanta, just north of.
You know Christ the King, right? It's like this neo-Gothic, just gorgeous church. Saw it online. I was like, well, you know, I'm going to go there for a daily mass.
Yeah.
Just like regular daily mass at 6 a.m. or something, because it was before I had to be in work. And so I walked down to the cathedral, and just, it was the mass was celebrated beautifully. It was a daily mass. There was nothing special. There was no music, you know, but there was a shocking number of people there at 6 a.m. I couldn't believe it. You know, it was probably like 50 people at least. And, you know, nothing was sung except, I think, the Alleluia. They did sing that. But again, the way I had this moment just during that mass, the priest, when he consecrated the Eucharist and when he did the elevation, you know, he was facing the people and he's holding up the Eucharist. We're all on our knees. And I just had this moment where just like in my mind, I thought, this is true religion. Like, look at all of us. Like, we're here at 6 a.m. facing Christ. Like our gaze is oriented toward him, you know, as he's like holding up the Eucharist. And I just thought, this is what I want, you know, like this is what I'm thirsting for, is this like Christ-oriented sacramental life. And it's probably in a way like my first experience of Eucharistic adoration, right? And like the power that can come from just like gazing upon Christ in the Eucharist. Because I couldn't receive sacramentally. And so I went every morning. I was there for a week. I went every morning at 6 a.m. to the daily mass because it just affected me so much. I went back home. I tried another parish kind of close to my house. I was going, I don't know. This one's, you know, the music just did not speak to me. I was just really struggling until Ash Wednesday came along. And I was in Salt Lake City that day for work. And I just was like, oh my gosh, today's Ash Wednesday. I'd forgotten. And I thought, I wonder if when the cathedral is having mass. So I looked it up. They had a noon mass. And so I was like, I'll go, just kind of on a lark, right? I had been kind of dipping my toe in these different experiences of Mass. And I go into the cathedral, and I don't know if you've ever been to the Salt Lake Cathedral.
I've heard of it, haven't been.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's beautiful. There's a few, the only thing I'd criticize is they have these very modern Stations of the Cross paintings. And my main criticism of them is that they just do not match the rest of the cathedral. The rest of the cathedral is just like this beautiful painted, like all these bright colors and very, looks like probably the way it was built in the early 1800s or late 1800s, early 1900s. Anyway, but it was packed. I mean, there was barely room to sit. And I remember this group of army servicemen and women who were like taking up an entire row, a couple rows in front of me in their camouflage, in their gear. And I just was like, this is cool. Like everyone's here on Ash Wednesday. And they had a choir singing in Latin. You know, I still remember so clearly the chant we sang when the ashes were being given out. I was just about to confuse it with the Adoro Te Devote because it's not that. It was, oh geez, see, I'm almost 40. Anyway, beautiful Latin chant.
Yep.
And I just was like, I just remember thinking to myself, if this is what Catholicism can be, then like I have to take it seriously. Like this is something that I can't write off immediately because I've seen like its best expression. And it's not even, this was a Novus Ordo liturgy, right? It just was celebrated so beautifully. And so at that moment, I kind of determined like, I'm not going to let the liturgical issues keep me from becoming Catholic. And then like a month later, lockdown, you know? And so I'm just like, I spend the rest of the summer, like sitting at home, watching Mass on TV. I would always watch the cathedral stream because there was nothing else I didn't know any other parish really. And so as the time went on, I kept studying, I was reading books, you know, and, okay, I have to think about like how order to share like these kind of final steps.
Were you kind of out of Orthodoxy at that point?
Yeah, I had kind of stepped back from Orthodoxy.
You didn't go back and forth at that point?
No, because I had like, it's kind of like, I've tried the Orthodox thing and I kind of got stuck. It's the best way to describe it. I just felt like spiritually stuck. And so I was like, it's time to try something else.
Did you have a priest reach out to you, or did you?
Like a Catholic priest?
No, an Orthodox priest at the time.
You know, I had two priests, Orthodox priests that I was really close to. And I don't remember kind of how we kind of, you know, and we never like broke contact or and like, I'll never speak to you again. It was just kind of, you know, they're busy and I kind of stopped coming. And so we just kind of fell out of communication type thing. And so but I was starting to gather myself, my own little cadre of Catholic priests, right? Like when I would meet, like the priest that said that Mass at the Ash Wednesday, I emailed him afterwards and he became like something of a mentor. And then a few weeks later, I went to Mass again at the cathedral before lockdowns, and a young permanent deacon who was about to be ordained was like giving the homily, you know? And I thought, wow, he seems so impressive. Like he's young, he's like, you know, young-ish, he's like in his mid-30s, something like that. And so I emailed him and he and I have become like really close friends. Like I visit him most of the time I go up to Utah. He's ordained now and he's a pastor at a parish up there.
So I can understand why, as you were still leaving the LDS Church and still unsure of where you were going, that you may not have used the internet, right? But this is 2020. I mean, did you start looking at YouTube channels?
Oh, yeah.
Or
I was
Catholic
probably watching your
Answers?
channel at that time. But I'm not sure. But yeah.
Yeah, or Catholic Answers, like looking for questions to...
I mean, on everything.
Answers,
I had like my method. I would read what people said about it.
Yeah.
I would read the critics.
Yeah.
And I would read the response to that. And if there's any response to that, you know, I just kind of like, I want to hear both sides. I want to hear all of it. Because I wanted something that could hold the weight of faith, you know, like something that could like, that was like worthy of of like entrustment, of like really giving myself over. And not just sort of like, well, you just have to believe, but like there's good reasons to believe, right? And not just reasons that were subjective, not just like I've had these experiences, that's good reason to believe. But like I wanted to give my whole person to Christ, and my intellect is part of my whole person. Like, yes, I'm a spiritual person, but I'm also an intellectual person, and I needed to have that engaged in a way that worked, you know, not just sort of like it works mostly, but then there's this last like 30% that just like doesn't work. But if you ignore that, then it works, right? It's like, no, I need it to work. And I mean, all I can say is that like I found that to be the case in Catholicism. Like in every case, and we didn't talk about this, but like I did have a short period of time when after I left Mormonism where I was like, is God real? Like, is Jesus the Christ? Like, do these things even back up? And so
I want to tell you about a course that I have created for men to overcome pornography. It is called strive21.com/Matt. You go there right now, or if you text STRIVE to 66866, we'll send you the link. It's 100% free, and it's a course I've created to help men, to give them the tools to overcome pornography. Usually men know that porn is wrong. They don't need me or you to convince them that it's wrong. What they need is a battle plan to get out. And so I've distilled all that I've learned over the last 15 or so years as I've been talking and writing on this topic into this one course. Think of it as if you and I could have a coffee over the next 21 days and I would kind of guide you along this journey. That's basically what this is. It's incredibly well produced. We had a whole camera crew come and film this. And I think it'll be a real help to you. And it's also not an isolated course that you go through on your own, because literally tens of thousands of men have now gone through this course. And as you go through the different videos, there's comments from men all around the world encouraging each other, offering to be each other's accountability partners and things like that. Strive21, that's strive21.com/Matt, or as I say, text STRIVE to 66866 to get started today. You won't regret it.
And we didn't talk about this, but like I did have a short period of time when after I left Mormonism where I was like, is God real? Like, is Jesus the Christ? Like, do these things even back up? And so I remember, I read a couple books. I was really affected by this book by David Bentley Hart called The Experience of God. It was just so beautiful. And just a few other works about sort of like, I read Benedict's Introduction to Christianity. I read some works by Bart Ehrman, right? And then I read a response to him. It was a book by a man named Larry Hurtado called Lord Jesus Christ. It's a scholarly work about ancient Christian liturgies. And sort of his contention is basically like Ehrman's like picking apart the New Testament, saying like, well, there's this, the Jews didn't really start with Jesus being God, then he became God. Hurtado's scholarly work is like, if you look at the way they worshiped, it's totally clear that from the very beginning, Jesus was divine for Christians, right? So it's kind of like this counter type thing. And I found that much more persuasive to me. Like, you can pick apart the text and try to like be like, oh, what did they actually believe? But like, look at what they did. Yeah. Look at who they prayed to. Look at how they worshiped. Like, Jesus was divine. So I kind of went through all of that as well. And so I did the same thing with Catholicism. I read this. So I read Newman's Development on Doctrine essay on the development of Christian doctrine. And then I purchased this book by Dr. Ed Shashensky. I think it's Shashensky is how you say his name. He's an Orthodox scholar. I spent like $80 on the dumb book. It's this fat book called The Papacy and the Orthodox, A History of the Debate. And he's an Orthodox guy. But I thought, if I can read a scholarly account of the papacy from an Orthodox scholar and come away thinking that it's a plausible institution, that'll be good for me, That'll be like enough to sort of be like, I've done my due diligence. Yeah. Right. And I did, and he's a very good scholar. His book is very much like Eric Ibarra's book, which I saw you have on your shelf right over here.
I love Eric.
Which is sort of like neither Eric nor Ed Shashensky, I shouldn't call him Ed, I don't know him. Dr. Shashensky, neither of them say, hey, it's totally obvious that this one is the right one. Right. And I actually still agree with that.
Yes.
Like, I don't think it's obvious when you get down to like Catholicism versus Orthodoxy.
Yes.
And that's okay, But like when I read the book by Dr. Shashensky with kind of Newman's model in mind, I was like, I can see the Catholic position here. And I kind of had like some priors where I was thinking about my experience in Orthodoxy and like, it would be nice if there was this person. And I thought, well, I think there's a really plausible case that this is an institution of Christ, that like he wanted the church, that the church operates in this Petrine way. The Orthodox agree that it's Petrine, but the Petrine ministry is not just local at the particular church, because the Orthodox are like, the diocese is Petrine. The bishop is Peter in his diocese. And Catholics will be like, yes, that's right. But the Catholic Church says the church is also Petrine at the universal level, where the Bishop of Rome is Peter to the universal church. And the Orthodox, typically there's multiple Orthodox positions on this, but a very common one is to say all of the institutions above the particular church are kind of like man-made institutions for the convenience of governing the church on the earth. They're not God-given things, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I kind of came across, you were asking like, did I use the internet? Yeah, I read books. I kind of gobbled everything up. Mm. I probably read way too much, which my RCIA director actually told me that directly. She was like, get out of your head.
You're like, no.
Because we're near the end, but as we get close to RCIA, I kind of had a panic right before.
What do you think that came from?
I think that it came from, if I'm giving like a naturalistic explanation, I think it came from just sort of like the trauma of having left the faith already and fearing joining something that I knew had a lot of problems. Mm-hmm. And like, I didn't have, some of those problems bothered me. Like, I can't pretend to be like, oh, I didn't care. You know what I mean? I was kind of like, there's some problems here. And I was just kind of worried about joining something that didn't.
Well, to give yourself over to it. Like,
to like really give
yourself
myself
over again to something that's just going to fail and fall apart.
Yes. Yeah. In fact, this thing, I wanted to share this story. Around this time, I was at my friend's house in Cedar City that I mentioned. And I was close to becoming Catholic, but I had all these fears, and I was kind of like, I don't know what to do. Like, if I end up not becoming Catholic, what do I even do? Am I just going to sit here in this like middle space for the rest of my life without the sacraments? And so, once again, I had a dream and I was sleeping in his basement, and in the dream, it was a while ago. In the dream, I heard a voice, and I'm trying to remember if like in the dream it was an angel talking to me or if it was just a voice that I heard. But I heard a voice that told me a prayer to pray. It was like, Isaac, pray this prayer. And I have it written on my phone, and I'm going to read it to you.
As you look that up, I just want to share something. I told my wife that I had a dream recently, and it was kind of spiritually informative and may have been prophetic if it were inspirational. And I said, obviously it means nothing, and she's like, yeah, because God never spoke to anybody through dreams.
Right, exactly.
So, all right.
Yeah, I mean, I think you got to be cautious about these things, right? Yes. Like, this kind of fits with like my whole mode of like, I think that we should approach all of these things with our whole person, right? Paul says, don't quench the spirit. Don't despise prophesying, but test everything. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so in this dream, because I wrote it down in this Google Keep note, which is still there.
So did you wake up after the dream?
I woke up and wrote it down.
Wow.
Yeah,
okay.
Right then. And this was the short prayer. It says, "O God, come and rescue me, for I am lost like a wandering sheep without a shepherd. I long for you, O Lord, hear my prayer." And I just remember waking up and being like, all right, I'm going to pray that every day. Wow. And so it almost became like this mantra. Like when I would have these feelings of like I would be afraid, spiritually afraid of just sort of like, what do I do? I would just be like, oh, well, I'm going to pray this prayer. Like just asking God, and especially that like plea, like I need a shepherd. Like I'm a sheep who wants to be in the sheepfold of the Lord. And I want like the earthly shepherd to come and guide me. So the interesting experience though that I had with RCIA in general was I found myself being able to take steps one step at a time that I just couldn't do when I was looking into Orthodoxy. So like after a few months, I just like joined the RCIA program and I was like in the fall, and it was all on Zoom, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And I was just like, yeah, I'll just do it. And when I joined, they were like, okay, well, you're joining a little late. So if you want to get baptized at Easter, we have the rite of acceptance like next week, And I was like, well, I'm not ready for that yet. I'm not ready to declare myself a catechumen. Mm-hmm. And they're like, okay, well, you might miss the boat. And I was kind of like, well, I don't want to be rushed.
Yeah.
So I didn't. But after like 4 weeks, I was like, I'm ready now. And I contacted them and they're like, yeah, you know what? We'll do a one-off rite of acceptance for you. Okay. And
they were probably shocked at how much you'd read.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah.
Although I suspect there might be more catechumens that are well read than I presume.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It does happen. It depends. And that's the hard thing about RCIA is you have like people like me where I've already read the catechism and I already knew.
And there are other people who are like, well, my wife's Catholic and
Right. Yeah, there are other people who are like, I remember the first time I went to RCIA, I was there, and another woman who was like, so what's the New Testament?
Oh.
And I was just like, okay, yeah, it's hard to hold a class for such a wide range
Crikey.
of people. There were times, like not to toot my own horn, but there were times when the person teaching the lesson would be like, Isaac, is that right? And I would be like, yeah, I think that's right. Like that matches what I've read and what I've learned.
Where's your wife at during this whole process of you're leaving once a week, presumably, to go to RCIA?
Yeah, she is just kind of, so she's obviously, like, even to this day, she's an active, believing LDS member. And, but she was overall, like, she was supportive and trying to be supportive.
Yeah, God bless her.
Like, it's not always easy. Like, we both have had moments that don't, like, wrap us in a lot of glory. But just overall, she's just like, hey, if this is, like, something you need to do and you believe in, then you do it, right? So she was supportive, and, we just kind of worked through it.
What have you learned? For those who are watching who are either converting to Catholicism and they're unequally yoked, as it were, what have you learned that you would tell someone who's just beginning this journey?
It's not your job to convert your spouse. That's probably the most important thing. Like, do not have that orientation toward your spouse where it's like, my job is to convert you. It's just your job to love your spouse. And that doesn't change whether you are in the same faith or in different faiths or whatever. Like, the Holy Spirit, if the Lord wills it, the Holy Spirit will convert them, and you can be a good example. You can live your faith, in as much as it can be a peaceful thing. You can share your beliefs and talk about, what you believe and how it's different from what they believe. But like, if you feel, and this is like a just broad, good marriage advice, it's not your job to change your spouse.
Yeah.
Right. And like, I'm not saying, I don't share that because I'm totally successful at this. I say it partially in large part because I was not always successful at that. So that's probably my main piece of advice.
Now, you have an obligation, and if this gets too personal, you tell me, and I'll back off because I want to be respectful. But you have an obligation to raise your children in the Catholic faith.
Yeah.
How do you do that?
Yeah. Well, how do you do it? Like, what does it mean to raise your children Catholic when you're the one who's Catholic, but your spouse isn't? And especially if, like, the kids' lives didn't start Catholic and they started in a different context. So. And
where do you live now?
We live in Arizona.
Okay.
So about a year ago, we moved to Gilbert, Arizona.
Okay. So a lot of their friends Mormon? Yeah.
Most of most of their childhood is kind of like in an LDS context.
Yeah.
So I'll tell you what I'm quite certain it doesn't mean. It does not mean that I go to my wife and say, just so you know, the kids have to become Catholic because I became Catholic and I have an obligation to raise them in the Catholic faith. What it does mean is I have a special obligation to share my faith with them and to make sure that they know my faith, that it like is a live option for them, that they understand it and that they see me living it and they see the beauty of the faith. And I think that's basically it. Like I there's not much more.
Like, do you teach them the Hail Mary or some other prayer that might be offensive to your wife?
Yeah. I don't know necessarily how offensive each of those prayers is. But
do you and your wife pray together?
We pray as a family. Yeah. We don't usually pray like as a couple.
Do you sort of make the sign of the cross, or do you say, well, I don't need to do that?
I make the sign of the cross. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And so this would be my other kind of advice. That's something I've kind of learned through hard experience.
I'm laughing because I'm thinking of like a parody of the man who has no prudence and just starts putting green scapulars everywhere.
Yeah. You can't figure out every single issue. You can't resolve every issue on the first day. Like, you take each day and each issue as it arises, right? Like, there's always this temptation. We both felt this temptation of like, we need this like grand plan, this like grand theory of how we're going to resolve like everything that comes up. Like, what if this happens? What if that happens? What if the kids want to do this? What if they want to do that? Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
And like, you can't do that.
Well, not just that, but I would think even like we just need to have this like one big conversation.
Right.
Where we can finally ease the tension and figure out what's going on.
Yeah. No, as with like everything else in marriage, an issue comes up, you have to address it with love and compassion and just like figure out the best way forward that you can think of. So like right now, in a practical standpoint, this is how we do church. So, I mean, I go to mass every Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
Every other Sunday, the kids will go to both churches.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of like the kids one Sunday will go to just meet with me to mass, and then we'll come home, and then they'll be done for the day. The next Sunday we'll go to mass in the morning, and then my wife's LDS ward in the afternoon. And then the next Sunday, the kids will just go to LDS Church and come home, because we don't want to overload them. We used to go to both every Sunday. It was too much for the kids, you know, like we don't want it to become like this burden where they're like, oh, church, I hate church, you know? Anyway, so like, that's just what we do practically, you know, and we kind of take turns and we try to focus on what we have in common. There still is a lot in common, you know, in terms of like things that we believe about morality, even just like, you know, we both believe in the New Testament and we differ in some interpretations, but like we both believe in the gospel. We both believe in the Sermon on the Mount. We both believe in Jesus's parables and his teachings. And like we share those things with our kids. We read the Old Testament together. Like we share Bible stories with them and we teach them to pray and all of that. So like there's a lot that you can still do.
That's good.
If you like try to focus on the commonalities.
What are some things that Catholics can learn from Mormons? And I know this is a general question because there are some Catholics that maybe got nothing to learn from Mormons, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, just kind of generally speaking, what are some things that we could learn from our Mormon
The two
friends?
things that immediately come to mind are like the incredible value of like home piety, and like consistent worship in the home. Just like really basic stuff like pray together, read scriptures together, and just make it like a habit that you do all the time. And the value of serving like in your parish and being part of the parish community. In the LDS, there's a lot of Catholics that do that, but there's a lot that don't.
Oh yeah.
And then just
Most
like
don't.
disengage. In the LDS context, they're very bold. Like, and part of it's the theology. It doesn't feel bold because they expect it. They're like, we are going to call you to do this. They don't ask, then they say, will you accept that?
I love it.
You know? I mean, how would it be if like a new Catholic moved in and the priest was like, oh, I'm glad you're here.
Here's what you'll be doing.
Here's what you're going to be doing for us. Will you accept?
Yes.
Will you accept? And if they say no, be like, okay, well, can you do this instead? Right? Type thing.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I try to be involved in the parish. It's just kind of like my Mormon way. I have a very Mormon way of being Catholic, right? Like, I don't think it's possible for me to do it any other way. Like, they kind of laugh at me. It's like, what can I do to help? Like, what can I be involved in?
Yeah.
And I'm like, how about this? I'm like, great, you know? So, yeah, I would say those are probably the two biggest things.
Do you actively try to help Mormons see the truth of the Catholic faith?
If they're interested. So I've had a lot contact me online in the past, you know, if I could just like
are you open to being contacted after this interview?
Yeah, I'd be open to it. Sure.
Do you have a way in which people could
I do. Well, I
contact you?
actually created like an email that, and I meant to share. Okay, I have 2 emails I want to share.
Okay.
I know we've been going a long time.
No, this is great. Stephen, also, just so you know, Stephen, I'm going to have him. He gave me a new email he just set up.
That's the one of the ones I wanted to tell you about. So I made one because I don't want to give out my personal email address, but I just got on Gmail. And so I made one that's like ldstocatholic, ldstocatholic at gmail.com. If someone wants to email me, I can't promise to respond.
Yeah.
But I've had lots of LDS people reach out and be like, hey, I'm interested in Catholicism. And I've talked to a bunch of them before. So, but I haven't been like, you know, out there being like, hey, become Catholic, you know? Yeah.
It's a saying Jimmy Akin shared with me once. He said, he who is convinced against his will is of the same opinion still.
Oh, yeah.
And I think it is. I mean, you correct me if I'm wrong, because I think like, I don't want to pretend that I'm more wise when I'm just more lazy as I get older.
Yeah.
But there is wisdom that comes from when you were riding your bike through the rain for 25 minutes to now when you're like, well, if they're open.
Yes.
So I think,
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
So what are we learning here? Because I'm with you. So like I try to evangelize in very non-awkward ways. So I'll say to somebody, if I see them wearing a cross, I'll say, glory to Jesus Christ.
Yes.
Just like whether they're Protestant or whatever, Orthodox or what have you.
So I was just reading, Pope Francis just released I don't know what it's called. I don't think it's an encyclical.
I think it is a new encyclical.
Okay, an encyclical on Teresa of Lisieux. I don't know if I'm saying that right either.
Oh, maybe we're talking about different documents.
Oh, he just released it like
Lisieux.
Les yeux. Like yesterday.
Okay.
Or something like
that's
that.
not an encyclical. He did release an encyclical. I apologize. I'll shut up. It was like last week, so I figured that's what you...
Laudate Deum, right?
Yeah, it was like two... Sorry.
Yeah. No, like just yesterday.
I'll see myself out.
Yeah.
To be... we can cut
Thursday,
this. We can cut
Thursday,
this.
Right.
To be
why
fair.
aren't you as up to date on Catholic things as I am? Haven't you read the thing the Pope released yesterday? Come on.
You just said the
it
Pope
good?
released a document, and my immediate thought was
I haven't finished it, but so far it seems really good.
Yeah.
And
I love Therese. Man, she's beautiful.
I don't know that much. I'm a baby Catholic,
I
right?
was just in France, kneeling in front of a tomb.
Oh.
I call her Mother Therese.
So
Love her.
This is part, and
Did
I know
I say that I love her? Get that.
I'm coming to love her.
Man, she's so good. She's so good.
Let me read this paragraph from Pope
All right.
Francis, because I think it speaks directly, like exactly to this question we're talking about. And I know that some of his statements on like evangelization and proselytism and stuff can be controversial sometimes, but just hear what he says and hear how he quotes St. Therese. He says, "The final pages of her story of a soul are a missionary testament. They express her appreciation of the fact that evangelization takes place by attraction, not by pressure or proselytism. It is worthwhile reading her own words in this regard." So this is a quote from her. "Draw me, we shall run after you in the odor of your ointments, O Jesus. It is not even necessary to say, when drawing me, draw the souls whom I love. This simple statement, draw me, suffices. I understand, Lord, that when a soul allows herself to be captivated by the odor of your ointments, she cannot run alone. All the souls whom she loves follow in her train. This is done without constraint, without effort. It is a natural consequence of her attraction for you. Just as a torrent, throwing itself with impetuosity into the ocean, drags after it everything it encounters in its passage, in the same way, O Jesus, the soul who plunges into the shoreless ocean of your love draws with her all the treasures she possesses. Lord, you know it. I have no other treasures than the souls it has pleased you to unite to mine."
24 years old, ladies and gentlemen.
Can you believe that?
It's unreal.
Yeah. Doctor of the Church.
Yeah.
So I was reading that like yesterday when I was flying out here, and it really, it like speaks to this exact question of like, if we really love the Lord, then others will come along, or at least that's our hope and our prayer, right? And so, again, like if you focus, I can understand the idea of saying, if you focus on, I've got to convert people, I've got to bring this person, I've got to bring that person, that can really come off bad to them. And it can also be just like an unnecessary burden on your own soul. But if you just say, what I've got to do is love the Lord and just like go deeper into the ocean of his love. And I love that she's just like a torrent. If you've ever been to the beach and seen like a,
yes,
like
I've
this,
been almost taken out by them.
Yeah, almost taken out by them. So it
back out
just
into the
drags into the water, right?
Yeah.
Like that should be our goal. And that's easier said than done. Yeah. Like none of us love the Lord in the way that we wish we did.
Well, I love what you're saying because you're talking about putting first things first. And often what we try to do is put second things first.
Yeah.
I was speaking to this woman who said to me in a moment of vulnerability that she's afraid her daughter hates her. And she's so afraid of her daughter hating her. Well, okay, what do you do if you're afraid your child will hate you? You love her.
Yeah.
Like you don't hate her.
Yes.
You serve her. That's otherwise all you're doing is manipulating the other. If you're like, how do I make you not hate me?
Yes.
I'm putting second things first. And it sounds like you're saying something similar here. It's like, how can I help my family love Jesus? Well, I cannot actually do that.
Yes.
I feel like that's actually impossible.
Yes.
So here's what I can do. Like I can love Jesus, and I can try to be not off-putting to those I love.
Yeah. Well, and in as a parent, you do have a sacred responsibility to teach your children about Christ, and to more than just sort of being like, oh, I'm going to go do my own thing, right? Like there's something more that happens there, but there's no constraint with Christ. Christ does not force. He stands at the door and knocks. And as difficult as it can be to kind of like when you have someone that you just like want to join you, right? To be dragged into this torrent with you. Because I'm the dragging, in her thing, you're not the one dragging. I'm not, the torrent is not me grabbing someone and yanking them to the ocean. The torrent just is my love for Christ flowing toward him, and just naturally others get caught up into it, but it's not through force. And that's so hard as a parent. And I know I say to my children, I apologize. I'm sorry. I so often do get caught up and just like, we're doing this now. You sit down, we're doing this thing. Like, listen, you're not paying attention. And they don't always catch why, like the love that's behind that.
Totally.
Yeah. And that's hard. So, it's not easy being in a mixed faith family and a mixed faith marriage, but you just approach it with any kind of the same way you would approach any other issue, just with grace, love, patience, respect for each other, and just, you tackle issues that arise as they arise, and you do the best you can.
What is the single best book you would recommend to an LDS looking into Catholicism or beginning to question the truth claims of the LDS Church? That's
a good question. So I don't think that there's an adequate book right now. And I tried to get Joe Heschmeyer to write one, and he stopped responding to my emails. I really like his book, The Early Church is the Catholic Church, more because it shows kind of like a methodology of how to like read the data that I think is really helpful, and like how to think through how we understand what the doctrine of Christ is. Like that's a question I wrestled with a lot in my conversion. Was like, growing up, I was basically taught like, here's the doctrine of the church. If you want to know if it's true, just pray about it. And if you have this experience, it's true, done. And if later you come to doubt it, you should just rely on that earlier experience, really, and just kind of don't worry about it, kind of thing. That's a little simplistic, but that's the gist. So I was really troubled. Like, how do I know the doctrine of Christ? And I think there you just like turn to the scriptures and what did the apostles teach? They taught, Paul says, if anyone, or even if I or even an angel teaches you something different from what was taught, let him be anathema, right? Test the spirits. Lord, Jesus says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will go to the kingdom. Oh gosh, I can't believe I'm butchering this quote.
Right. Everybody calls me Lord will be,
Yeah,
safe.
But he who does the will of my Father, and he says, like, there will be many false prophets who go forth and say, we did all these amazing things in your name. And you might even say, like, we had all these amazing experiences and we produced such experiences in other people. But like, there's always a standard of, in the New Testament, what you consistently see is that the teaching of the apostles is the standard by which you measure the faith that you receive. So if anyone says this is the faith, you measure it by the apostolic deposit. John is very clear about this when he talks about testing the spirits. He's like, the way you know a spirit, whether it's from God, is if it confesses that Jesus is the Christ, which in his time was being denied. So he's giving an orthodoxy test, right? He's like, this is apostolic teaching. So if you have a spirit which denies it, that's a false spirit. That was a little bit of a tangent, but the point is that like it's a different way of approaching questions of doctrine. And so Joe's book, the Early Church was the Catholic Church, is quite good in that regard. The Apostasy That Wasn't is also a pretty good book by Bennett. I can't remember his first name.
Oh, yes, I know who you mean.
Yeah. He kind of like shows...
Is it Elijah Bennett? Or,
no, it's not Elijah.
Thursday. That's right. Look up The Apostasy That Wasn't.
The Apostasy That Wasn't.
Jeremiah, something like that.
No.
Oh, sorry.
Anybody who types this, there's only one book named this, so that I really don't know his...
I would strongly suggest reading the New Testament in a modern translation with a good commentary.
Yeah.
Rob Bennett?
Rob Bennett.
Thank you.
Rod Bennett. Rod? Yeah. Because...
That's the other thing I found so... just too what do you say? Too predictable, or too... that the LDS basically use the KJV.
Yeah.
With some differences, right? But it's like, well, this just happens to be this thing that came out of the Protestant tradition.
Yeah. Well, they only use that in English. They kind of like pick a Bible translation in other languages and be like, that's the one we use for Spanish. This is the one we use for that. Okay. But
I mean, even like one way you could show that Mormonism is not the religion willed by Christ is to show that the Apocrypha, the Deuterocanonical books, are inspired.
Yeah,
like, you just have to go into that controversy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they even have a complicated relationship with whether how the Bible's inspired, right? Like they believe the Bible contains errors. and that it's been corrupted to some degree. That's the explicit teaching of the Book of Mormon, that like there were plain and, as it says, plain and precious truths that were removed from the Bible by some kind of shadowy early Christian church or something like that. But I think studying the Bible, because they read in the KJV, the New Testament often is just kind of treated as like a source of proof texts, especially the epistles. You know, if you read the Gospels in the KJV, it's pretty straightforward. It kind of reads the way you would expect most of the time. But some of the epistles in the KJV are very hard to understand. I mean, they're hard to understand even in a good modern translation. Paul is a sophisticated thinker and theologian. But when you read it with good commentary, you start understanding better the full message of the New Testament and how it differs from LDS teaching. So those would probably be some of the books that I would recommend.
Can I recommend a specific translation that I think has helped me overcome that problem?
Sure.
I read the Knox for devotional, and I think it's I think it's phenomenal for overcoming the issue of like the letters feeling like series of proof texts rather than complete works. So
I like Cal Keating's idea that the best Bible is the one you'll read.
Yeah. So I on my mission, I found a Bible on the shelves, a New Testament on the shelves of one of the apartments I was in. And it was just called The New Testament in Modern English by Phillips is the last name, like J.B. Phillips or something. He was a friend of C.S. Lewis. And it's very much a dynamic translation. Like, I'm not going to pretend that it isn't. But if you ever, his goal in translating that was he wanted the epistles to read like letters. So you could like, you would experience it in a similar way to how they would have experienced it the first time. And I don't claim he's always successful. I wouldn't make it like the only Bible you read, but it has an amazing ability. You sit down and you read Romans and you feel like you're reading a letter, and you totally get the overarching themes of what Paul's trying to say. Yeah. And so I love that. I still have that same copy. I took it with me from that apartment. It's on my shelf at home.
Have you had Mormon missionaries come to your door since?
Well, I mean, my wife's LDS, so they like stop by.
Fair enough. They come all the time.
Like we've had them over for dinner and stuff.
And does this topic get addressed, or are you like, please don't bring it up?
Yeah, we've kind of just been like, hey, you guys can come for dinner, and at the end, if you could just share like a generic Christ-centered message, that would be fine, and then we'll see you later. You know. But
do you have any? Because I mean, imagine if one of these missionaries was like you were back in the day, you would have just been red meat, wouldn't you?
Well,
like if you had went somewhere and there was a Catholic, there's a Catholic at table
who's informed in that sort of thing.
Wouldn't you want to get into it?
Well, sure, I'd be willing to, but like you said, like missionaries are. Here's the thing about missionaries: first, they're kids, or I mean, they're adults technically.
I know that's what I'm not calling you elder, dude.
But they're so young, you know, and they're like out here on a specific mission, and they may partially be out there because they feel a cultural pressure to go. They're not in a position in their life where they're like ready to receive all these things. So if you just like get into it with them, they're just going to shut down.
I was saying the opposite. I'm sorry. Maybe I wasn't clear. What I was saying is, have you not found one of these enthusiastic young missionaries trying to take you down, trying to help you?
No.
Well, I find them to be quite respectful.
Yeah, they are
never
respectful.
had a bad experience with a Mormon missionary.
Yeah, no, they're typically good. And I think I was respectful on my mission too, but I was very zealous.
Yeah.
Fantastic,
man. Well, thank you. Anything else you want
to? No, I think that's good.
This is great. Thank you very much for sharing. And yeah, all right.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. All right.